But yeah, so it should be going on live soon. So you'll see like the button in the top left that says live on YouTube. And then I'm going to make you the host again. So I would just, maybe before you start, let the students know to share that link of the YouTube link with their friends and family instead of the Zoom. So like this stays just as the people that are in the class and not a bunch of random people in it.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi, everyone. How are you?
Hello.
Hey, Mar.
Do we have that link to the YouTube?
Yeah. So if you click the button in the top left, you can click copy streaming link or view stream, and then you can share that.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Did you get to see the virtual exhibition, Amar?
I have not.
Pretty good.
It's amazing.
Cool. All right. Well, I'll be watching on YouTube. Let me know if you need anything. You can just email me or text me.
Okay.
Thank you,
We'll
Nick.
do that.
No
Thank you,
problem.
Nick. Bye.
See you later.
Bye.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi, Annie. Hi, Laurie. Hi, Eve. Bonjour.
How are you?
Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
After
It's gonna be a little bit of a later evening for you.
doesn't matter. I just had a gin and tonic to make sure that I will just resist, and I just sprayed for all of you guys some of the latest, a little bit of the latest Hermes men's fragrance. So I'll be it will freshen my brain on what's left. So I'm very happy to see you again. Well, those I know and like, and they're happy to meet those I haven't seen yet so far.
Great. And you will be joining us tomorrow as well, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a masochist.
Good to see you, Eve.
No, it's really my pleasure.
Welcome back. Good to see you. Welcome back.
Are you growing a beard now?
Say what?
Are you growing a beard now?
Yes, this is the new me.
Yeah, that's good.
I hope you like it.
Whether I like it or not won't change anything to the fact that you're keeping it.
Absolutely not. For your own sake, I said that.
The pandemic is almost over, it seems, though. At least, you know, in our areas. Isn't the beard a sign? Wasn't it a sign of a last year kind of item?
It's reminiscent. It's the last
remembering. I see.
part of it.
I see. For those of you that are already present, we're already streaming live on YouTube. There is a link in the upper left-hand corner, I believe, that can be copied, and if you don't see it, I will put that in the chat. To keep it, you know, amongst friends and family. But if you want to share that, that's for the students specifically, and everybody else. If you want to share that with other people, feel free to do so.
We should be starting at 2, Cordula, correct?
Yes, we're waiting for a couple more reviewers.
Ruth is joining us as well.
She is, as well
Great.
as Edson.
That's an excellent.
At least that's what they said.
How things are in Nice, Yves?
Raining.
Rainy?
Things, yep. No, it is raining. Things are sort of okay. It looks like we'll never see the end of the tunnel. We still work from home. We are supposed to reopen exhibitions and public venues and everything as from May 19th, but we won't be ready to reopen until mid-June. So we're working on that. And when it comes to our architecture center, it feels like, you remember lately when there was a big traffic jam on the in Suez, in the canal? Well, it's just about the same thing. I feel like there was a block at middle with lots of ships behind waiting for it. So we have a bunch of events and exhibitions and stuff which we have to present in a very short time and in a very complicated situation. But well, we're all art geniuses, and I think we'll make the most of that.
I'm sure you will.
Yeah. And at last we can resume traveling again progressively. So if we guys meet again in like 2 weeks time, I will be able to tell you everything about the opening of the Venice Architecture Biennale.
That's great that you're going. I might try to go for a couple of days.
I'll let you know whether it's worth it or not. The funny thing is that I think that all architects, and that will be the end of the long answer to the short question, when entering Italy, upon entering Italy, travelers are supposed to stay 5 days locked up in their room. But I mean, the world is gathering in Venice, and they'll be flying in and all running directly to the Architecture Biennale, which will probably become a sort of huge cluster with cops everywhere checking our documents. And I'll let you know about that too. Architecture is, that's life in the fast lane sometimes. But I won't tell this to the students who are listening to us tonight, because they've been working hard in the past few days. So no joke about architecture in the fast lane, because I guess they didn't get too much sleep in the past few days.
Hello, Cordula, I made it too.
I'm so
Hi, Ruth.
glad.
Good to see
I'm
you.
so glad.
Yeah.
I'm going to welcome you officially in just a minute.
Well, it's a bit dark over here, so I just had to get a light on.
Yeah, well, you and Eve
Here.
are again in the same time zone.
I overheard your discussion about the Biennale. I was asked to come as well, but
Are you going?
Are you coming? Are you going?
I might, but I'm not sure yet. It's so weird because some people have one vaccine here, and most people have none, and it's a lot of the openings are virtual. So I don't know yet.
If it's confirmed that you're going on the days of opening, I guess you have my email in the exchange with Cordula. Let me know, and maybe we can have a spritz over there.
Absolutely, many spritzes.
Oh yeah.
Maybe I'll surprise you and be there as well.
No.
The spritz sounds really inviting right now.
No, if Cordula comes in, I know she's coming our way. Then it's a certain because it's a 4-hour car ride from Munich. I mean, you're vaccinated, and so we will just see.
Just in case anyone is coming, well, this is just between us. No one will sell this information to the press, but I'm the king of spritz.
It's good that we're streaming live.
Live on YouTube.
And I prepare them on the in penthouse on the roof terrace of my best friend in Venice, who has a gorgeous apartment in the building called Il Gardella.
Oh, wow.
beautiful night.
I'm coming, Eve. Count me
Yeah,
in.
yeah. You don't have
count
to
me
say
in.
anything else.
It's
say no
also
more.
my
Everyone's meeting, so we will celebrate the all of the successes of the students today and
Correct.
tomorrow, and we will have a toast with spritz in their honor.
Correct. And
Absolutely.
Edson is invited as well, and Laurie as well, who both are joining us as critics this afternoon, or even
Hi,
for
Edson.
our
Hi,
European
Laurie.
friends.
Good to see you.
So,
Thank you for joining us.
thank you for joining us. So I think we're going to get this started. We have 5 presentations this afternoon. Welcome everybody to the final presentations of the undergraduate thesis at the Tulane School of Architecture. We'll be viewing the final presentations of the candidates for Master of Architecture in 2021 this afternoon and tomorrow, all day. And for those that just tuned in the chat, there is the link to the live YouTube channel. We're live. That you're welcome to share with friends and family if they want to see what you've been up to over the last few months and the last year. I'm gonna share my screen. But first I wanted to, for a brief introduction, but I wanted to introduce our critics this afternoon. Ruth Bergtold just stepped away. So I'm gonna start with Edson Kabalfin, who is a faculty member at the School of Architecture. He's the Associate Dean for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, the Director of the Social Innovation and Social Entrepreneurship Program, and a Professor of Practice and Design Thinking, which is a very long list of accomplishments. Thank you, Edson, for joining us. Ruth Bergtold is the owner and founder of Yes Architecture in Munich and a professor at the University of Applied Sciences. Her practice focuses on multi-family developments and commercial architecture, as well as product design. And her practice is situated in Munich, as I just said, and also in New York. Laurie Smithy is an architectural historian, theorist, and design educator. She's an adjunct lecturer at the Tulane School of Architecture, and her research focuses on design sensibilities and aesthetics, to simplify it very much. And she has a doctoral degree from the University of Michigan. And Yves Nacher is joining us from Nice in France, and he's the director of the Forum for Urbanism and Architecture. If you wanted to add anything, Yves, I didn't get a chance to complete your bio in time.
Oh, that I didn't grow any more hair than last year. No,
that's right.
Said, I'm the director of an architecture exhibition center in France, and I'm an architect, basically non-practicing, always in the critics and stuff like that. I also have a musical education, but this has nothing to do with our topic today.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And I am going to share my screen quickly. Let's see. Can you all see this? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So again, these are the final presentations after a year of research and design for the undergraduate thesis at the School of Architecture. These are our critics. The one circled in blue will be joining us this afternoon, and some of you are joining us tomorrow again. So a thesis at the Tulane School of Architecture is explored by researching an architectural topic, which takes place in the fall semester, and developing a position on that topic, and then following that research up through a proposal in the spring semester that tests some aspects of the research. Generally, we're focusing on finding out about principles and parameters that constitute the discipline of architecture, and figure out how they inform individual proposals that respond to specific challenges. So the fall semester is broken down into a series of different parts where for the first time this fall, we've investigated kind of seminal projects and have tried to identify the thesis statement that's kind of woven into these individual projects, always kind of asking the question, what are the issues, what is investigated, and how are they addressed through the project? And then we segued into applying that to the students' own work that they had developed up until this point to figure out how some of these principles can even equally be identified and also be kind of extracted from their work retroactively. And then we asked the students to select from a prompt of a series of different briefs, one kind of proposal that they would test their thesis against through the development of a design project. And then the spring semester, starting in January, we started with a series of schematic design presentations, and we have worked with the students to develop their proposals. I first and foremost should have introduced my colleague and co-professor and co-director of the spring semester, Amar Eloueni, whom I wanted to thank very much for his efforts and collaboration over the course of the spring semester. The fall semester was co-taught with Dean Iñaki Alday, whom we developed the fall sequence with. So in regards to the pedagogy for the thesis year, there's 3 different parts or components that we pay attention to. One is the position. Kind of the goal is to locate, again, personal trajectories and interests within the larger field of architecture and within the extended environment that influences architecture in regards to societal, cultural, and political thinking. We try to define the framework within which an architectural project situates itself, and kind of identify aspects of this practical and theoretical framework in order to formulate a thesis statement. And then, ultimately we try to translate the research and the topic into a design proposal that ultimately contributes to current and also historic discussions in the field of architecture and the fields surrounding it. The fall semester, again, was consisted of a development of a series of research trajectories. We worked on a series of diagrams that put different projects, architects, and movements in connection and conjunction with one another. So here you see some of the mapping work that came out of that. And then in the spring semester, we've been focusing on the design proposal development. The students were presented with 4 different briefs that they stayed close to or kind of deviated from over the course of the semester. So you will see projects that are closer situated within one particular brief and others that have moved further away. But what it offered was a starting point and kind of a level of guidance initiating the design proposal. So the briefs consisted of a focal area of Lake Charles, Louisiana, that was recently devastated by a hurricane and is still in the process of recovery. We've identified the potential themes within these briefs. I shared them with the reviewers this morning. So some had to do, in this case, with resilience. The focus could also shift in regards to larger master planning issues or focusing on specific components of the site that was identified. So in this case, the site is along I-10. It's a beach type of area with a series of abandoned or in process of being reconstructed or re-envisioned buildings. There's a parking garage that a couple of students have focused on in terms of their thesis and their design proposal. The second brief is focused on Haiti, Cap Haitien, specifically, again, an area that was, a few years ago devastated by an earthquake, and the opportunities here lie in material strategies, planning strategies, housing strategies, post-disaster reconstruction, etc. This brief was loosely centered around the use of specific materials and also loosely centered around the program of a women's shelter. But as you see, there's some deviation and some freedom that was applied in regards to the interpretation of it. The third brief offered the AACSA steel competition with a focus on workplace wellness. So focusing on steel structures with the program of work environment or reinventing a work environment or revisiting that, which is certainly interesting in times of pandemics and post-COVID work resiliency and strategies. And then the fourth brief loosely offered the Evolo skyscraper competition as an opportunity, and out of this resulted high rise, but also ground scrapers that took this as the brief as a point of departure, but then reinterpreted the program in regards to the specific circumstances surrounding the individually chosen sites. And here we have all the students. We have 2 teams, and other than that, everybody worked individually. The 5 students circled in blue will be presenting today. And that's it for my little intro. Are there any questions before we start?
So we can add, Cordula, some of the students decided to work in teams. Most of them developed their work individually. So we will see, I don't know if this afternoon we'll see some teamwork, but most of the students work individually on their projects.
Correct. It was optional. So the students could choose a team partner or decide to do this on their own. Okay, with that, I think we're going to get started, and we'll start with Annie. Annie, you want to share your screen?
All right, everyone see this?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Ann Davis. This thesis is entitled Runway Refuge, Village Relocation in Rural Alaska. The Arctic is experiencing some of the most extreme symptoms of climate change, most notably rising sea levels and melting permafrost. By the year 2100, a large amount of this existing permafrost is expected to be gone, shown in this red line, drastically changing the Arctic landscape. These photos show some of the erosion caused by this melting permafrost, rising sea levels, and increased storm surge in rural Alaskan villages. These villages are now struggling with the choice between building up seawalls to stay in place or relocating to higher ground. Currently, there are at least 32 villages in Alaska that are considered imminently threatened by this melting permafrost and rising sea levels, 11 of which are actively facing relocation, shown in red, one of which has successfully relocated. Geographically, these villages are very unique, situating themselves on islands, peninsulas, or along rivers. These locations were often chosen for access to food, as most villages still survive off subsistence hunting and gathering. What is similar between these villages is the airplane runway, shown in red. Because these villages are so remote, air travel serves as a lifeline to bring groceries, mail, and people in and out. This is because the road systems between cities and villages in Alaska are nearly non-existent, as shown in the map on the left. Instead, the air travel network covers nearly the entire state, allowing travelers to use planes the way most people here use taxis or buses, shown in the map on the right. Within a village, residents mainly use snowmobiles or four-wheelers to get around because both of these can go off of the dirt roads and sometimes into neighboring villages. Cars are still present, but not a necessity. This chosen site is Unalakleet, Alaska, in a Inupiat village of 700, situated on the Bering Sea, where I grew up. It is low-lying with hills and tundra to the east and is one of the larger airports in the area with 2 runways. Here, the highest ground is shown in red, and you can see it's mostly covered by these asphalt runways. This infrastructure, sited with both wind and stable ground in mind, often allows for higher ground to be built up with the runways themselves, and they're highly invested in pieces of infrastructure. So by building upon this existing infrastructure of airplane landing strips, rural Alaskan villages facing relocation can find refuge from rising sea levels while strengthening access to public health services and food services. So in order to continue use of the runway, the shorter runway, which is 1,900 feet long, will be raised, creating new datum to suspend civic program underneath, protecting it from these rising sea levels. The new structure will house relocated civic program focused around food and public health. Houses will move to the hillside where some houses already exist, allowing residents to relocate on their own terms. These existing houses on the hillside are little less than a mile away from the existing village. So this new civic program includes existing programs such as airport buildings, grocery store, clinic, food processing, with the addition of indoor food production. These study models show some of the earlier experiments with raising the runway and organizing program underneath. This proposal raises the runway about 40 feet, densifying the program from top to bottom. Here's the program organized underneath. You can see the airplane hangar going all the way to that civic program with the greenhouses dispersed within. This is a zoom in of the previous slide to show some of the detail within these spaces. This section cuts through the entire length of the runway, which is again 1,900 feet long, showing the relationship between the airplane hangar and some of those smaller civic spaces. Food is very important to the community, much of which is hunted and caught, is shared within a village. Nearly all of the protein that people eat here is hunted, fished for themselves. This shows a community kitchen. Groceries here can be very expensive as goods need to be brought in by plane. So the addition of indoor food production strives to give more access to fresh produce. This shows a grocery store. These next two images are photos of a physical model. Here you can see the larger runway has also been raised and gradually ramps down to the existing grade, and also serves as a site for possible expansion or any sort of covered outdoor space. In this image on the left, you can see the existing road that would lead to the relocated homes. And I will leave you on this slide. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Annie.
If there are other slides I'd like to go back to, this is a thumbnail slide.
May I start asking questions?
Yes.
I think it's a super fascinating project. You know, Cordula and I, we're both from Germany, and we have an airport that's now closed. It was closed during Corona. It's Berlin-Tegel, and it used to be the only possible supply for all of Berlin when the wall closed around Berlin, and that included you know, quite a large area. And so they were running out of coal to heat at that moment, and also they ran out of any food supplies and so on. So I think it's a super fascinating proposal. You mentioned that the sea levels are rising, and therefore you're rising the landing strip. How about the rest of the village who actually needs these supplies? And I think it's very nice how you sort of turned the village around and made it a support system for the runway. But what's the whole logic behind it? Like, are you going to raise the village as well? Or what is the thinking behind it? I'm a bit unclear about that.
Yeah, so I'll go back to one of the maps I have here. So there are currently existing homes on higher elevation, up kind of in the hills, where the residents who live here would gradually move, on their own terms. They are not going to physically live underneath the runway. So all of this program, other than that indoor food processing, is existing. It's just simply being moved from the low-lying village to suspended and raised underneath this. So the use of this program and the access to this program stays relatively the same. It's just more separated in either the landing strip itself or as a community of homes up on the hillside.
Okay, so all the inhabitants are moving and you're raising the landing strip, and then you're offering all these extra, the supply stations where whatever is being, brought into Alaska or that specific site will be reprocessed or distributed.
Yes, yeah, the only additional program that doesn't currently exist in this village is food production, indoor food production.
Well, the food production thing, yes, is something new. If I may ask one more question, like an extension of Ruth's remarks. I find it very interesting too, but I would like to hear you a little more about what apparently lies behind this. When we see this slide, we realize it would have been, and the previous slide where you showed what was actually the sort of higher level grounds, it would have been a lot more simple to go uphill where those housings are and to just relocate a traditional village uphill, and people would have been okay for the next 100 years or so. So you made the dramatic decision, which brings people together in one structure, is a sort of war against urban sprawl or village sprawl. And what's your strategy about that? I find it interesting that what do you have in mind, or what is your strategy about densification, about density? This is a discourse about density. I mean, we have a huge scenery, lots of space, and you decide to do not a shrinking city, as I remember a famous exhibition back in the mid 2000 years, shrinking cities. So you decide to densify things, to bring people together, to organize interconnected spaces, as opposed to the huge scenery, the openings onto the ocean, and all of the available ground. So what is your strategy? What do you expect from this strong decision, that of working on hyperdensity when you have lots of cheap space around, I guess? So what's the stance?
Yeah, so the original decision to populate this runway was made because this infrastructure is already so highly invested in. It's not something that would kind of erode away as easily as most houses in this area would. And also the buildup of these runways and the siting of these runways are chosen by engineers to be on higher ground, and also in some ways they build up to create higher ground. So the idea of losing this very strong infrastructure and not continuing to build off of it as almost a solid ground was the original idea, to kind of raise it and repopulate it. Another piece of this is that the runways provide nearly everything that you need to live in a lot of these villages and are already so connected with the villages themselves. So although the land, yes, of course, is sprawling and you could go as far out as you want, that connection to air travel and these runways is incredibly important for everyone who lives here. They, some people take these planes daily to get groceries, to see their family in another village. So by not just scrapping kind of this existing infrastructure that is both solid ground and also heavily relied upon, it then becomes just this hub of both transportation and civic program that is all supported by the air travel itself. So groceries come in through here and are just kind of immediately put in the grocery store or mail, or the public health professionals that serve the clinic itself.
Although your design is very different, and this will be my conclusion, although your design is very different from what they did, I guess you have in mind this museum, which was built a couple of years ago in one of the three Baltic republics. There's a small town which is the cultural and university capital of the countries, and the National History Museum was built, and the only available ground was that of a former Russian military airfield. And since it was a lot more expensive to tear everything down and to remove the airstrip, they actually dug up the ground under the airstrip, and the museum is actually was actually shoved underneath the airstrip. So it's a totally different design, but well, I like your idea.
I think what is also interesting in the project is to think about the replicability of it, because
Yes.
there are multiple villages in Alaska that are facing the same problem. The question is how to come up with a solution that can be easily replicable, because they all have more or less the same airstrips, airports, facilities, and to think about the infrastructure and how an infrastructure can start to house some of these programs is something interesting. I mean, if you know the Ministère de la Défense in Paris, and this idea of an infrastructure that is building the idea of density and what you can achieve with that. So,
and while on the subject of replicability, do you think that the same technical solution can be used in every case, or could there be variations? I mean, in terms of your system, okay, the elevated airstrip and building something underneath, what can be done with local resources, and is there? I mean, we can imagine figure out everything between high super technological solutions and a sort of genius DIY with local resources. I think there's a variety. To go further with the idea of replicability, is it always cloning, or is this system, can this system be a sort of reflection on what is around, and an incentive to find, well, local solutions? Can it be low tech or whatever?
Yeah, these are just some of the villages, but I did choose one of the larger airports and landing strips with, it has two. But I think there are a lot of extreme cases where maybe this wouldn't necessarily be the best strategy, but you can see a lot of them are situated on slightly higher ground and could very similarly be raised and populated underneath. And often the landing strips, the size of them are related to the size of the villages themselves.
And I'd like to ask about your strategy of concentrating the civic uses under the runway, as you had, like provocatively proposed. And because I'm just looking also like this, the image showing you where they were before, and then how you were then condensing them into that strip. And what I'm curious is your sense of as the residential area becomes concentrated on the other part, and there's like this divide between kind of the civic spaces and then that of the residential spaces. And I wonder, what do you think might happen? Because then part of the success maybe of having some of the civic uses or program being distributed within the village is that then it becomes more incorporated within maybe their daily lives, right? And then by separating them, somehow you're also like creating a divide between the public and the private. Somehow like the private life, the domestic is in one part, and then somehow the public life is all under the runway. And I wonder, could it have been possible to maybe have some of the civic spaces also in the residential life? Because then let's say I'm a mother and I need to bring my kid to the doctor, because my son is sick. And then the kind of divide then, not only just philosophically about the divide, but also like practically, how do you think that might impact then the kind of the village, and then also then their civic life as well, right? So I'm curious, like what's your reasoning, and then also maybe like your take about the potential unintended consequences of such an solution, right?
Yeah. One of the civic programs that actually isn't housed underneath the runway is the school, because that's something that kids are walking to every day, and it does make more sense to be with the housing. And in all of these villages, nearly every building is multifunctional. So the school gym is also kind of a community center, or a place for gathering. So I do imagine that there would still be a few civic programs scattered along the housing. And I did think about that divide, and the kind of thought is that because it's so focused around food, and the culture of food here brings communities together, that is something where you are out hunting or fishing, and either you have your own fish drying racks at home where these houses are, or there are community ones. So there's still some programs scattered within the housing that mirrors the civic program underneath the runway. It also is not too far of a distance, which is another way that I kind of thought about it. People are used to getting on their snowmobile or their four-wheeler and just driving down the road to the grocery store or the post office.
So Annie, may I ask a last question? I like your section a lot, but it looks like a turned around Alaskan village where, by the way, here in Germany, we get a lot of advertisement because you might have heard that we don't get vaccines around here. So they're giving us, if we go and have a vacation in Alaska, we get the vaccine at the airport. So we see that 10 times a day. I mean, for people who still watch the telly, I stream everything, but even I see it 3 times, which is totally unrelated. But, we can't get vaccines here yet. But so that was the advertisement for any airport that you fly into Alaska. How come you're taking this village and you turn it around? And I understand it's kind of a structural support, but I love that idea. Can you say something about that idea? Or does it just look like that?
Yeah. First, about the vaccines, actually, everyone in Alaska in these villages are getting their vaccines at the airport because the healthcare providers just fly in, vaccinate everyone, and fly out. So this idea of everything happening at the airport is already existing in some ways. As for the kind of upside down reverse houses, this actually came slightly later in the semester, where I went and just looked at all the building facades and drew them and took pictures of them on Google Street View, and thought, okay, well, let's quite literally move these buildings underneath, and what is the best way to kind of densify from this new raised runway down. So in the case of a 100-year storm, a very strong storm surge, there is very little program that's actually touching the ground. This would be, storage. In many places, it's vertical circulation, but it's in many ways from the character of these houses. I'll go to this photo here. Yes, this one. This photo was something that I look back at a lot while designing this project, and taking the existing very colorful pitched roofs of the village. I wanted to continue that in the proposal and keep a lot of that character.
I think it's a really nice idea. I really like your section. Are you aware of the fact that depending on the wind direction, the planes either come in from one side or the other? I mean, I'm not asking you for the structural system. That would be something for my students here at the University of Applied Sciences, but you're showing a very thin runway.
Yeah.
There's a big steel plate inside.
Yeah, so this smaller runway that is populated is it's called the cross runway, and it's only used in cases where the prevailing winds have taken a turn, and they're now perpendicular to what they normally are. So most likely this larger runway would be the one used, and then only smaller planes for when the wind is very different from what it normally is would land on this cross runway.
Thank you.
It reminds me of Inception, just like how the buildings were like twisting. What Ruth was saying also, it reminded me of that. So it's an interesting strategy. Sorry, Laurie.
No, it's okay. It does remind me of Inception too. Thanks, Anne, for this project. I mean, I think some of my comments are going to reflect some of what's already been stated. Yeah, I'm trying to get my head around it. So, I mean, I think it's an absolutely fantastic project. It's totally radical. Yeah, but I'm still, like that said, I'm still sort of struck by like how sort of practically minded it is, that there's, yeah, I guess I just want to encourage you to like embrace the radicalness of it. I think it's lovely that you have sort of figured out all these practicalities, and that the upside down village serves a purpose with the water levels rising, and the putting it under the side runway that would be used less because of the winds and all these things. But as Eve was sort of pointing out, like this, it is a really radical proposal about density, and taking a position on that. And yeah, I guess I just also like really want to see a thesis project that kind of places itself in the discipline, or with some relative to some larger questions. And I think that comes up in the beginning when you start talking about this idea of relocation. And so I just want to, I want to commend you, and I want to maybe just open up the conversation a little bit, and think about like where else the project could be situated. When I hear relocation, like one thing I think about is like the ways in which a lot of communities in America were relocated with sort of infrastructural interventions into the urban landscape. And so this is like a take on relocation that's embracing the infrastructure, and that connection between infrastructure and sort of village life, we might say, is flipped on its head a little bit. And I would also, I guess, reiterate some of what I heard Edson questioning, which was there is this kind of intimate connection between the runway and the village itself. And in some ways, that connection is being reinforced by putting the civic program underneath the runway itself. But then when it's like, but then people are going to move to houses on the higher ground, suddenly there's a disconnect between the runway and the other development. So yeah, I think thinking about the ways in which the project as a whole kind of knits together this community and the whole vision of the community as it changes with the kind of the ecological issues that you're trying to work around or work in advance of. Yeah, maybe those were a little bit scattered. There are a few different comments in there. I don't necessarily have a question. I feel like everyone has already asked really great questions. And I want to, congratulate you on a really exciting project, and maybe just plant some seeds for thinking about how it could connect to the discipline more. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting about this project or this proposal is that, we had several discussions about this over the course of the semester, is that it could go in a variety of different directions, right? It certainly touches on a lot of things, which is great, and which is ideally what we're hoping to achieve in the semester. Right. So right now, like its conception is conceptual, right? Its expression still, lingers in the conceptual realm, and it also has some sort of practical solutions embedded in it, right? And what Eve brought up before in regards to, resource management and materiality, and how this is constructed within the means of the community. If I understood that correctly, I think that's a really interesting aspect, right? Who's building this, how, like what are the resources that are utilized to make it, right? So that's one way this could be explored further, or you could have emphasized, right? The other one is what Lori just brought up in regards to thinking a little broader, right? Like how is density evaluated, right? If you zoomed out, right, what does this mean for other communities, right? For the region, for how things shift in terms of their balance now that this is introduced, right? And then thirdly, what Ruth brought up in regards to, structure, right? And articulation and focus on that, which plays back to materiality a little bit as well, right? How is this really resolved? How is this this possible, right? What are the implications of actually making this happen? So, so I think, and there's probably other directions, that I'm not mentioning right now where this could be taken further, or where this could linger longer. But I think what's great is that it touches on all these issues, right? There's all these possibilities that that allow us to think about this region, and also certainly, it draws attention to the challenges of the region, which is prototypical, or which are prototypical. So and it offers, certainly, a starting point for finding these solutions. So I think it's great.
Yeah, and I think just to add one thing, when it comes to relocating the village, and maybe the idea of reusing materials and stuff like that as a part of the memory of what used to be there before, and which will become part of the new village, is maybe something you can keep in mind. From high tech to low tech, I don't mean you have to build everything with driftwood, but when it comes to how to say perpetuating, giving a new life to the memory of what used to be of the former village, maybe the idea of reusing shapes as you did, or reusing materials and stuff could sort of fuel your reflection as well.
Yeah.
Just an idea.
Yeah. Actually, some of the houses that are currently in this village were moved from the hillside after World War II. They were old war buildings and are now everyday homes.
I think we all acknowledge the kind of radical aspect of the project, and this is something to be applauded, and something that is very positive, and it's great that we're starting the afternoon with this and the entire session for the thesis projects. One would think that, if you're doing a thesis, you want to be radical to a certain level, where you can imagine that with a lot of work and a lot of engineers involved in a project like this, there could be a possible version of this happening somewhere in the world. I mean, I'm sure we all have in mind the Stephen Hall project from the 70s in Manhattan, of the housing projects on these bridges. And even if there were, a series of drawings and very early in his work, they were very informative, and they were extremely important to a lot of architects, and they are a reference in architecture. So to think of a 1 semester, 14 weeks project and where this is, I think you did a great job, Annie, and you should be commended for it. So very well done.
Thank you.
Great. If there are no other comments, we're going to move on to Eli, I think. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Good job.
All right, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay. My name's Eli, and my thesis is titled Tactical Adaptation, an Incremental and Opportunistic Approach for Expanding Adaptive Reuse. So my thesis statement is that millions of American buildings remain abandoned for years because current design and development models are too slow to reuse them. And by designing and planning for incremental and opportunistic adaptation and applying the temporal logic of tactical urbanism to the building scale, architects can generate a new set of strategies that will make adaptive reuse more feasible for buildings that are difficult to reuse through conventional methods. So a lot of this comes from the idea of tactical urbanism, which has come into the spotlight more during the pandemic. And tactical urbanism demonstrates that minor changes in environment can catalyze major changes that would otherwise not be possible, and that the obstacles to transforming space may be more psychological than tangible. And by introducing interventions that are reversible and sometimes intended to be temporary, tactical urbanism builds momentum and political will for more permanent changes in urban environments. And so my proposal extends this kind of framework to the scale of a building by moving through a tactical and minimal phase of adaptive reuse in order to generate that momentum for a more permanent reuse of the building. So these graphs basically explain the different, how this departs from the conventional model of adaptive reuse. And so by conceiving adaptive reuse as a continual process, the focus shifts from a sudden transformation to a slow process of maintenance and iteration of a building. And so this is kind of extension of the idea of the continual house from Stuart Brand's How Buildings Learn. And it also draws a little bit, I would say, on Elemental's incremental housing projects, just for the idea of incremental building. So the advantages of this approach are kind of spreading the risks of development over time, allowing a more iterable and adaptable design that changes in the face of new conditions, and then transferring money that would otherwise go to loan repayment to the growth and improvement of a building and maintenance. And then lastly, that it demonstrates that the middle phases kind of demonstrate the potential of the site to generate momentum for the later phases. So just to compare these two examples of adaptive reuse, they're both mid-century modern airport terminals that have been obsolete. And so this is the TWA Hotel in New York City, which was a reuse project that took about 17 years to come to fruition. And then this is a temporary project at the old New Orleans airport terminal that kind of utilized some of the existing features of the airport for a skateboarding competition. So while these projects have different goals, and this one is clearly more of a temporary reuse, I think it serves an example of something that could generate more interest in the site and make people think more about its potential. So my site is this parking garage on the north shore of Lake Charles, which was originally for Riverboat Casino, which was destroyed by Hurricane Rita. And I think this site is particularly appropriate for this investigation because of its prominence and its adjacency to Interstate 10 right here, which is the main route in and out of Lake Charles. And just the prominence of having this abandoned structure, which is seen as an eyesore, has a outsized impact on the broader community. And so the abandonment of this prominent site only adds to the perception of Lake Charles as hollowed out in the aftermath of the recent hurricanes, and thus the reuse of this site has benefits beyond its own boundaries. And additionally, the adjacency to the Port Wonder Children's Museum, which is being built, it has influenced the creation of a public space that integrates uses for children as well as just a more general public space. And so these images show, this is like a Google image search of Lake Charles, so showing the destruction in the aftermath of the hurricane, and really that this building has the potential to be part of altering this perception as the city recovers. So this parking garage, the existing structure, this is what it looks like in its abandoned state, and it has it basically has a ramp on one side. So most parking structures that have been adaptively reused for new uses are not this type of structure where the ramp takes up a lot of the building, but they're more of a single flat floor plate. So this is a little more challenging to be used for other uses, but I think that parking garages will increasingly be relevant for adaptive reuse with the rise of autonomous vehicles and other factors. So, so this is an important type of building to consider for adaptive reuse. So one way I look to get inspiration for what sorts of uses could come from a site like this is that the distinct spatial and cultural qualities of the parking structure enable and even encourage certain actions beyond the intended program of parking. So by looking at these images from TikTok, we can find a multitude of subversive uses for this type of building. And within the new model of adaptive reuse, these sorts of actions can be seen as an informal reuse that is the first step towards more physical interventions. So my proposal involves the creation of a public space, which I'm calling the playground, which occupies kind of the most special and most the parts of the parking structure with the greatest opportunities of the roof and the ground floor, and that kind of generates the funding and momentum to reuse the rest of the building for incubator spaces, which are basically small office and workshop and studio spaces that can be used by the surrounding community and small businesses. So basically to improve the daylighting and the circulation of the structure, I'm proposing cutting out parts of the ramps, but so that the ramps can be maintained as kind of a circulation space that's less direct and is more activated, along with the direct circulation through the building. And so that the circulation space through the ramps really retains the same qualities of the existing parking garage, and it becomes a space where a lot of these actions that we've seen can continue to take place. So within the playground space, these minimal and mobile objects are placed, and these extend the possible range of actions seen within the informal reuse of the parking structure, and they can be moved in case of flooding. So they're particularly appropriate for this site. And they're strategically placed to activate distinct zones within the space, such as the food hall and the skate park. And so these can be, some of them can be either off the shelf objects or custom designed. And then within the incubator spaces, these are just some examples of different configurations that these can take on. And it's basically this space, which is based on the structural bay of the parking garage, but is basically infilled with very adaptable materials that can be reused for different purposes at different times and experimented with. So this is a series of axons that shows the different increments and how this incremental process actually takes place. So in the first phase, there's no removal of the ramps required, but just the ground floor is infilled with this food hall space, and the outside with a playground and pools. And that's followed by the removal of the ground floor ramp, which creates this new entry sequence and covered playground space, and a number of different programs which expand the playground and enhance the public space this building. So that's followed by the roof space, which still doesn't require the ramps to be removed, but it implements a skate park and seating area so that people can experience the kind of quality of this rooftop space. And that's followed by the removal of the ramps and the insertion of basically the incubator tenant spaces, which can be added gradually at different times. And there's a core inserted in the building that holds the different services and infrastructure that serves these spaces. So then once that core is completed, there's also a rooftop bar and pools which are added to the roof. And so this is the final phase. So basically the revenue that comes from the incubator spaces basically funds the completion of this core and the implementation of the remainder of the rooftop space. So these are just sections showing kind of the different occupations of these different spaces and the different spatial qualities of the kind of incubator spaces and the playground. And this section shows kind of the quality of this continual ramp that winds its way through the building and how maintaining that really connects the different programs and creates a better experience through the circulation path. And this is a render showing within that ramp space what that experience might feel like. And the rooftop space looking out over Lake Charles. And then finally, this is a perspective of the approach to the building along the beachfront and how this kind of ground floor program kind of spills out into the outdoor space. So that's all I have, and thank you.
Thanks, Eli.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Eli. Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, I think it's a really fun project, and it's come a long way. I don't know. I still like. I came away from the last time I talked to you thinking I should have mentioned super graphics. Like, you need to be looking at super graphics. But that's besides the point. No, sorry. I'm like, I jumped in because I'm excited, and now my thoughts are like very scattered. I mean, I think there's like two very different kind of ethos to this project. Like, I think the playground is so wild and cool and fun, and the incubator is so buttoned up and where it ends up at the end, it looks, I mean, yeah, like the renderings at the end look very like bougie and cool, and they don't really quite have like the liveliness of like the setup of the kind of TikTok collage that you put together, and this idea of kind of enlivening the building, and not having like a set idea of necessarily where it can go, but kind of giving this kit of parts and seeing what emerges. And I know that we can't like necessarily plan what emerges, but I'm really interested in that kind of emergent idea that's in the first half of the project. Yeah, I you know, if I have more to say, I can chime in later. I feel sort of like I jumped in because I got all excited because it's come a long way, and I think it's got a lot of really cool parts. Yeah, I think for me, like clarifying like what are the formal elements and the informal elements, and kind of playing that out even more would be really fun. And yeah, sorry, again, I'll hang back and hear what other people have to say, and then I might have more to say at the end.
Eli, thank you for the presentation. And you know, like what I appreciate about your approach is I was really struck by what even just the diagram that you were showing about like the difference between the incremental approach and the kind of like a an approach that's done, let's say, in one instant or like at one moment. And so I think like you were able to show that incremental approach. One thing that I was also struck with what you were mentioning earlier was the idea of how this was also about altering the perception of Lake Charles, of this area. And it's something connected to what Laurie was mentioning earlier also about, because looking at the perspective, if you can go back to your, maybe your exterior perspective, one thing that I'm curious is that then how does this become, how will this change the perception also from as you maybe approach the site, you know, from I-10 because of its such prominence in the area. You know, it's very open, and then you have those as you said, you know, the Children's Museum is also being built. I wonder what's your sense about like what will the approach be like? Will people still perceive this as a parking garage? Are you thinking of changing that perception? Because unless you go inside, you might not realize that it's not a parking garage anymore, right? So is there any indication that the kind of, as you're focusing a lot on, of course, like the internal development and internal incremental sort of change, is there something also that on the outside is also communicating that incremental change? And I wonder, if you've thought about that as part of like the messaging, because you're also arguing that it's about changing the perception, and how is it also changing perception kind of in the scale of it in the landscape, and also along I-10 because of its strong relationship with I-10.
Yeah, I think the idea of changing perception is really relevant, because just the fact that this building is so prominent maybe means that it doesn't matter so much like what the reuse of it is. In terms of changing perception, it's more just like any kind of reuse, and if people are able to see this building like coming out of its abandoned state, regardless of like what that looks like specifically, that will go a long way towards changing the perception of it. But I also think it's really important that the most kind of vibrant spaces that are created are the outdoor spaces of the playground, and that those will really be visible for people traveling along I-10 or traveling along the beachfront, and that those will really do the most work towards changing the perception of the site.
It's so interesting that you would even find a parking structure, you know, by the water. I think that all your ideas are very recommendable. You have a lot of cool, different, I would call them pods, you know, where people can sit. And by the way, I love the fan. It's almost like the fan above your head.
Oh.
It's almost making me dizzy. I couldn't stop watching it. But let's just say, I think you have a lot of cool ideas. I also think that it's very important to create these spaces close to a water area. And even in Manhattan, where Cordell and I lived for a long time, nobody was really facing the water. It just started like 20 years ago that people realized the importance of a waterfront and the recreational impact. And then I'm wondering, why wouldn't you put more, I mean, I love all the furniture you created and all the different, you know, pots in different areas. Why didn't you put more impact, or why did you put more energy into the facades, or how, you know, maybe facades that you could fold open, or different infills, or putting containers in there, like somehow MVRDV that does that all over the place. I'm curious about that. Why didn't you change the looks of that place in a more radical way? I mean, also I really go for your functions, and I trust you, and I think I trust that people would rent a place where they can do about everything. But why didn't you try to give it a different exterior.
Yeah,
the idea of Laurie's idea about super graphics and the sort of exuberance and generosity, that could be an idea.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a route I could have gone towards like doing a more radical transformation of the appearance. But I think that kind of ended up conflicting with the idea of completing something that's incremental and completing something that's adaptable to different uses. So the kind of materials and forms that are chosen of kind of and especially like maintaining the kind of simple like box of each of these incubator spaces. While it's like a less radical change to the look of the building that enhances like the adaptability, and it makes it easier for this sort of project to be completed incrementally, rather than something that that would be a more radical change, but would also kind of conflict with this model of gradual adaptation.
No, but I'm not saying that you should design the whole thing, but I'm saying that you could make sort of a catalog where you would say, this could be your container in there, this could be your sliding facade. You can take 3 floors, and you're also showing green walls and stuff. I think that some ideas for the inside and the outside, like sort of a catalog, like you're putting out this whole catalog of ideas for seating arrangements, working arrangements, and so on. And I think you shouldn't shy away from giving whoever is gonna, use this space, to give them ideas, because you're the architect, how to use something over, let's just say, 5 floors up to the top or across or whatever. That's the only wish that I would have.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, Eli, that it's like necessarily one route or another, but I think you could just, take the route further, and you could stop sooner if you wanted to, but you could also explore more. I mean, you have one semester, you've done a lot of work, and it's commendable. I don't want to suggest that like it's falling short. I just want to put out there that like, if you're gonna, as Edson say, like take on this idea of altering perception, like one could even take it further, right? And I mean, I think, starting to lose my thought. Oh, I know what I was going to say, that this idea of like change over time, I think is really compelling, and a lot of us are picking up on it. And again, I understand like the shortness of the amount of time that you have with your thesis, but there are basically 2 stages. There's like the playground stage, and the incubator kind of more final stage. And when I'm hearing Ruth's comments about maybe adding in containers or other comments from other reviewers about developing the exterior, these could be more phases. So the project could be even more incremental, as it were. So I think it's a great provocation, and could be even sort of extrapolated further out.
Yeah, I don't think this idea of envisioning the facade and the appearance in a variety of different ways works against this idea of approaching it tactically. We had in Berlin, after the wall came down, we had quite a few instances where existing buildings were, in the process of being re-envisioned, or, like discussions of them being demolished, led to temporal uses. And I think we talked about some of them, the Palace of the Republic, and an adjacent art hall. There was a temporary construction, which actually had a blank facade with the purpose of it being, redesigned and recommissioned every month or so, either by the public, some artists envisioned a public engagement. And then, like some artists, took it upon themselves to design something for the facade. But it was in constant flux and constantly changing. And it was a great opportunity to, to test, to explore, to advertise, to express, to write a variety of different strategies, that were not designed for long-lasting appearances, but consciously designed to activate, over short terms, right? Independent sometimes from the function that was going on inside the building. So that could, like one could envision the facade, and we didn't talk about that as an opportunity, but as a third element, right? That almost acts independently from the other two programmatic elements that you're already envisioning.
Eli, I'm not sure if I'm curious if you've looked at the example of Torre David in Caracas in Venezuela. It was like an old well, it was designed to be an office building, but then the owner died, and that then it was later on, talking about technical urbanism, it was then occupied and really taken over by a community. And they had built over time, just like what you're proposing, sort of different programs. They built gyms, they built stores there, which was a fantastic sort of example of your idea of what you're talking about, tactical urbanism. But there are also sort of ways then that they were able to really communicate that sort of change also from the outside, because it was also similar to yours, like a blanket, a blank, sorry, like a sort of like a blank structure. And so I'm just making me think about also like how you can push that further. I do appreciate, Eli, though, also like what you were doing, this shift between designing for cars versus designing for people. And that's why like the Torre David also reminded me of that, is that I think like what you are also allowing the occupiers or the inhabitants of this site is that then it's them sort of changing their environment. And I think that's embedded in your strategy, that you're, aside from it sort of being DIY, it's also about you're empowering them to be able to shape their own environment. And I think like one thing to then maybe consider is that then you're not dictating what it is, but you're just maybe setting up the framework from which then they can then make those incremental changes. So one thing that I'm curious to, and this is not for now, right? Maybe in the future, is that then, is there like a, like almost like an IKEA kit or guide, where then you tell them, okay, these are your kit of parts and this is how you do it, and these are the possibilities, but you keep it as kind of like an open-ended solution, which I think is already embedded in your approach. And so I'm wanting you to be more explicit with that, about this sense of openness and open-endedness to the project, right? You were talking about it, and so think about like how you're going to push it further, so that then you are communicating that it's not about you necessarily, but it's really the occupants who are going to shape and dictate the way this space is being used.
Yeah, I think we had a lot of conversations throughout the semester about like how open-ended it should be, and like what the role of the architect is if it's like a more open-ended kind of system. But yeah, I just want to clarify that like the examples of like the different ways the spaces can be infilled is intended to just be like a starting point. And then, yes, that like you're saying, that occupants could customize and change those based on the constraints that they're given, in like a basically infinite number of ways.
To me, there is an inherent contradiction in the premise of the project itself, and the fact that as designers, we are trained to be very specific about spaces and how they are used. And even if we say they are open-ended, it's a space that could be used in different ways. The examples that you mentioned in Caracas, Edson, is people taking over a structure and then doing their thing. And the minute you involve a designer, an architect in it, and say, let me design it so it is open-ended, it's a very tricky position to be in. Not that it's not worth pursuing or investigating as a thesis project, but it's always a very tricky one in which, the question is, how much do you design and how much you hold back, and that say, well, this is where people will come in and do their work and do whatever they want to design. And it becomes even more difficult when it is already an existing structure. And there are a plethora of examples from warehouses to parking garages that were taken over by artists and used over time. But there is never kind of a chief designer who is deciding where they should start and where they should stop. We will see later on, I think tomorrow, another project where it is a ground up idea for a project with an open-ended, so there is a type of infrastructure that is put in place for people to come and start using it in different ways. So I think it's an idea that is worth pursuing, but it is, you know, in the premise itself, there is already a contradiction in something that is very tricky to support. And it again, you know, this you did it, and that's good. You learned, I'm sure, a lot from it.
Can I respond a little bit, Amar? I think, I mean, I take your point. I think one of the things that happens, just to say to Eli in a thesis review, is that the conversation sort of can be bigger than your project sometimes. But so, I mean, I take that point, but I also want to push against it a little bit. And I don't think that it's sort of like a—
Can't wait to hear that.
I mean, I don't think it's a like a bottom up or top down sort of only unidirectional scenario. And so, I mean, I think in this case, like there could be like an element of narrative or storytelling. So like when it begins, we can't know where it's going to end up, but we can imagine that this is the first stage and these are the elements, the kind of kit parts that can get it kicked off the ground. And then maybe, you know, again, this sort of narrative element of like, you have to kind of imagine or narrate this fictional idea of like how it developed. And then you intervene at like a second level or another level. And so I think that there's some room to be in this kind of like mulchy middle ground of an iterative project that's a little bit ground up and a little bit designed. And it is, I mean, it won't be a perfect capture of what that might be, but one could still sort of imagine how it might play out and what the different interventions would look like at different points.
I would like to disagree with you. I mean, I hear your point and what you're saying, and I don't think it could be a middle ground. I mean, it's one way of approaching it is to say the thesis is to investigate a scenario of how this might evolve. And, you know, I'm not the designer. It's just a fiction of how this building might happen if it is given to a group of people that want to invest in it or and work with it. To me, you know, the closest that architects got into this conversation, maybe it's, you know, Tchoumi in Le Frénois and his project where he had the school program, which was a very specific program. And then he added this canopy and he talks about these in-between spaces, unprogrammed spaces, and he left them open to, you know, a plethora of scenarios of how students can come in, occupy these spaces as performance spaces. And he gave, you know, kind of a hint at what the use of these spaces can be. But to, you know, if as an architect, you're just playing a narrative, a scenario, I think that's good. But to be in, you know, the point where I disagree with you is being in this middle ground where you're saying, I'm the architect, I will design something, but at the same time, I'm going to let, you know, from top down and bottom up, and let's meet somewhere in the middle. Either, you know, you just play a scenario, or you're very specific in your intentions, but it's good that we disagree.
Yeah, for the moment we can disagree. We can, you know, have more conversation later.
I mean, it's interesting, right? It's also a matter of, you know, scale of intervention, right? You know, like what is the minimum amount that, you know, one can do or should do, you know, to set things in motion in terms of activation of a building, right? I mean, there's some examples where, you know, like specifically recognizable pieces of furniture, right, or gathering were designed, and implemented, right, that became attractors for people and something that is incredibly recognizable, and led to activation of the space, and then maybe other steps followed later on, But what is the minimum amount of insertion or alteration, right, or enforcement, that needs to happen, right? And some of the outcome to this question is ultimately theoretical, because like it's really something that would have to get tested, and then at the same time, it's also, I think it's good to draw attention to these issues, which I think this thesis is doing, same as the urban think tank research. I think it was for the Venice Biennale of a few years ago. Right, there wasn't any intervention suggested, if I remember correctly, but it was drawing attention to the status of this building and the status of similar structures, I think, in the context, if I remember correctly. But certainly this building, how it is occupied, right, how it is adapted and appropriated by the occupant. So that seems to be a valuable piece of research, right, in regards to utilization of these structures in the future.
Again, Eli, I think you achieved something really interesting this afternoon, is having reviewers disagree and engage in a conversation, and that's really positive.
Yep.
That we open a conversation, because it's not always, people think that we're always in agreement, or there. If you're able to point at a topic where people can disagree, it's a good thing. So if you put your finger on something that is really interesting and debatable, so that alone has a lot of merit.
When it comes to an architect's attitude in such an existing structure, I think, since we were mentioning some examples in the recent past and what happened in the past few weeks, I think you should check what the latest architects, the architects who got recently the Pritzker Prize, did a few projects like these, and the way in different situations, the way they acted as architects and defined the architect's role is interesting, whether at the Palais in Paris or in Dunkirk for contemporary art structure, where they doubled and sort of Xerox an existing structure, not filling it up absolutely, but trying to get the most of it. This could be a sort of inspiration too, or maybe you could find some interest in checking this out. But
you're referring to Lakatova-san, Yves, correct?
Yeah. Okay. Not as a final solution, but one of the many ways to deal with an existing structure, and saying, well, as an architect, I do almost, apparently I do nearly nothing in terms of design, which is not true, but I make it possible for other people, including the community, as others mentioned. I make it possible for other people to sort of project themselves into it and have the impression that they can have a role in writing a new story for the building. It sure isn't very easy to find this sort of in-between, if the in-between is what is relevant. But finding the right balance and the right role for the architect in such a situation is probably one of the toughest challenges that we architects have to face. Trying to be just stop it before it's too much. But it's an interesting challenge.
Yeah, I have seen a few of their projects, so I'm familiar with them.
No rush, just an idea.
I think we're ready to move on for the next project. Thank you,
Great.
Eli.
Great comments. Thank you, Eli.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have Alex next. Oh, we couldn't hear you, Alex.
Oh.
Say something. It's kind of breaking up.
Back up.
It sounds a little bit like Mars Attacks.
I hope not.
Should we give you a little bit of time and come back to you, Alex? Would you like that?
And Alex, you're in there twice now, so maybe it's
better.
Here, can you hear me now?
That's better,
Yes.
much better.
Okay, I switched. I have 2 computers. I thought this might be the case, so I apologize.
Okay, glad you were prepared.
Yes, I wanted to make sure that I didn't run into any time-consuming issues. Okay, so let me pull up my project here. All right. Okay, are you available to see this in full screen? No.
Not yet.
It's pretty dark so far.
Yep.
Okay, my apologies.
Seems like now
Here
we
it
can
is.
see it.
Here it is.
Okay. Okay, is that all right? If I might have to keep it on here. I apologize. The information
That's okay.
So do not worry. Okay. So my name is Alexandra Alex Satry, and this thesis is titled Adaptive Coastal Vacancy, focusing on regenerating degraded structures in the subtropics. So to better understand the concept of this project, I've highlighted 8 key terms that are identified here, with degradation being the main verb and the driving factor in this project through the landscape, the vacant structure, and the new development. The temporal components of degradation link these subjects together to create a representation of constant change in their existence with the natural world. So the Southeast United States is home to many coastal cities that face extreme threats of sea level rise, high tides, extreme heat, major precipitation, weather events, and land loss, which we all know as of New Orleans. So these subtropical climate conditions have created an environment where material degradation in the built environment occurs at an increasingly fast rate, which proposes challenges for vulnerable communities that are developing along the coast. The states along the Gulf of Mexico produce the highest quantity of construction and demolition debris, so C&D debris, in the nation, with 90% of it coming from the demolition activity. So pointing to the severity of the climate caused degradation in this subtropics. And the landscape is the major cities in the subtropical coast are shown here on this map, and they're part of the brackish landscape. So the combination of the freshwater and the saltwater creates some challenging opportunities to reintegrate the natural elements into the existing and the new developments. So flora in these regions can tolerate salinity, and they're very robust in their survival. So it creates very ideal situations for low maintenance management of the landscape that's being introduced and reincorporated. It creates, the brackish environment creates a landscape that becomes a buffer to the coastal communities, which I know we know mangroves in Florida and present along the coast, not specifically in this environment that I'm dealing with in this thesis, but definitely different types of flora that have that same kind of quality. And so because of the extreme humidity and precipitation, the major storm events and the other conditions present, the damage to the built environment in the subtropics is very severe. So, over time, inevitable and expected building degradation does occur, as in other climates. But when a extreme weather event occurs, such as a hurricane, the service limit or the safety limit of the structure is reached. The material degradation becomes very severe, and it affects the integrity of the building, and it causes major damage and loss of material. So this is followed by months of repair, and total demolition of buildings to make way for new developments that in the end are susceptible to the same cycle of climate threats as the prior building was. So the question is, how can we utilize these degraded structures on the coast while not creating more waste through the closed cycle of demolition? And the opportunity for responsible coastal development lies within these vacant structures that are scattered along the coast. So using an existing structure, we can generate an approach for selected demolition rather than total demolition, which creates protected spaces for the regenerated development. And through an installation in 1991, focused on the demolition of the war-damaged buildings in Beirut, Bernard Khoury stated that intensity of collecting information is translated by the gradual demolition of the existing edifice. So this perspective of memory-driven action allows us to value the existing structure and think of its future in an alternative to standards of development in the standard cycle, this closed system. So in recovering urban populaces, demolition to make way for new development and new construction is not a practical solution for structures that have retained spatial opportunities for activity and use. The existing structure can be used as a framework for introduced program and native flora, becoming a buffer for the development against the natural elements, just as the brackish flora is for the coastal communities. So in a statement, extreme weather and sea level rise continue to threaten new development along the urban coast, causing severe degradation and damage. Appointing vacated coastal structures as hosts for regeneration, we can transform the conversations of climate change implications to promote responsible development through selective demolition in the most fragile communities. The existing framework provides opportunities for program spaces, offering an amalgamated proposal that is an extension of the contextual landscape. So to further investigate this proposal through a place-based study with one of the briefs that we've talked about and been introduced to, we will look at the Lake Charles community that has recently been damaged by Hurricanes Laura and Delta in the fall of 2020, which most of you are probably aware of, but it was very, very traumatic for the city. So the city is one of many in the subtropical US that has a population under 500,000, and they rely on the gas and oil industries of its region for economic success, which one of my peers will be talking about in her project. So the city is not situated on the Gulf, but it's up north, up the Calcasieu River, adjacent to the actual lake known as Lake Charles. So the Lake Charles North Shore, which is highlighted in the map here, has been a spine of outdoor activity in the past. And recently with these hurricanes, there's a lot of damage and vacancy now on that strip of land. So there's a serious need for regeneration and responsible development for the surrounding community. So the Calcasieu River saltwater barrier is located a few miles upriver of the Lake Charles, and the lake exists as a brackish environment. So to be more specific, an estuary marine subtidal deep water habitat. So after studying these surrounding areas, the vacated parking garage that Eli had just talked about emerges as a visual landmark of the North Shore, reaching a height of 70 feet. So constructed with a steel frame and concrete poured floors, this vacated structure, it possesses the strength and the adaptability to become a vessel for transformational occupation. With a service life starting in the mid-80s, previously used as Harris Casino garage parking lot, a standard renovation of this steel frame parking structure would require numerous repairs, structural supports, a complete re-outfitting of the building systems, which would result in a development that would be just as vulnerable to the elements as the prior rehabilitation. And looking at the idea from a book of Architecture and Resilience published in 2018, there's a quote that I think really relates to just the overall party of this thesis. So it appears short-sighted to consider it acceptable to repair a system into a state where it can return to the point which it failed previously, and rational to support investment in resilient reinstatement that enables systems to bounce forward to safer states more capable of withstanding next event of similar or greater magnitude. And looking at the program for regenerating this vacated structure, the continuous idea of change in design, we can understand a preferential approach to transforming a structure. So similar to the other subtropical cities, the North Shore of Lake Charles is blasted with the hurricanes originating in the southern hemisphere, and the winds circulating counterclockwise blow westward and cause major damage on the southern and eastern sides of the buildings. So with this knowledge, the existing structure can act as a buffer for the new areas of development, leaving the most vulnerable portion in the southeast corner open for temporary and sporadic use. To activate the existing space, the 3 masses are introduced to guide users from one level to the next, to find space to fit their needs, their preference, with management offices located for the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, which is previously located on the North Shore. The well-being of the existing landscape is prioritized through this development. A performance space allows for the different kinds of activities, shows, meetings, events, flexible for options like a music venue or a classroom. The final mass is a restaurant, which serves the community and those who pass through on Interstate 10. And each program with a shared visual connection to the landscape supports not only the immediate transformed surroundings, but the larger community as well. And the service life of this structure, since it's existing in combination with a new development, becomes this kind of dual conversation and relationship that become clear when viewed together. So to understand the relationship to the new, the material degradation timeline shown represents these changes. And as mentioned previously, expected degradation will cause damage to any structure, but its timeline significantly increases when faced with a major weather event like the hurricanes. So the existing represented in black shows this, with the concrete represented in its degradation. And the new development, however, can live in a semi-protected state with the existing, slowing down its chances of severe damage over time. So by not demolishing, but encouraging the degradation of the existing, we can mitigate the degradation of the new. The proposed material for the new development is a Corten steel mesh, which showcases its material transition due to the relationship with its environment. And with the intentions of incorporating the development into the natural landscape as much as we can, the brackish flora is also used and represented as almost a tertiary buffer or representation of the environment's changing nature. And the proposed program for the new development spaces, they will differ per coastal city. Looking at this as one study, there are many subtropical communities that are facing this same problem. So as each community is in a different need of spaces, for Lake Charles, the environment and the outdoor recreation is the main amenity for this community. So the proposed would act as a new North Shore Recreation Center. The largest mass offers a performance and exhibition space, like I said, along with the main core of the building systems needed. The space overlooking the lake serves as a restaurant and observatory of the surrounding landscape. And the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries to be relocated within this proposal. There will be office space for department headquarters and management of the landscape. And the eastern view of this office to Lake Charles downtown creates a sense of connection to the adjacent management of the city, and the key role that this department plays in the regeneration of the community. And a contradiction between the new and existing spaces here makes this familiar structure an anchor point for exploring the surrounding landscape through this proposed program. So looking at the arrival, during sundown, the transformed structure would glow through the Corten steel, and it would, allure drivers in from I-10 to come and visit. And adjacency to the interstate is encouraged here. And the performance space almost acts as this ever-changing billboard to those that drive by. The performance space uses the interstate and the upper Calcasieu River and the landscape as a backdrop for its activity, subconsciously, if not obviously, to the user, informing them of the context And because of this flexibility of the space, the endless amounts of activities and events that play out here are all understood in relationship to the current place in time and space. And then the restaurant creates a place to really pause and observe the surrounding of Lake Charles with an observatory on the roof as well. So this elevated mass, it creates a sense of clarity with the surroundings and the surrounding environment. And the user begins to feel like they're almost floating over the lake. The celebration of the landscape is definitely evident in this mass and in this space. And the most expansive views of the context are available here for understanding, and all seen through this Corted mesh. And then a rental for kayaking, boating, fishing, hiking, bird watching, all these different activities that really create the core of this landscape connects this ground level to the existing. So these masses really become the temporal spaces that exist and change with the environment through time, and through this adaptive life cycle, the user can begin to understand how valuable the existing really is in generating a responsible relationship with our natural environment. And I will leave you there on this slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you so much. First stupid question, you're putting this, you're clearly proposing these incubators. What is the idea for the rest of the floors? Maybe I'm already too far ahead in the night so that I missed it.
No, yeah, it was so meant to promote really just the free circulation and free use of the space, unprogrammed, sporadic, whatever the user really finds in their benefit to explore and have a visual connection to this relationship. And then those being emphasized, you know, this kind of found object, this structure that's vacant, that kind of quality, I think, is really just enhanced by these interior volumes that you can occupy.
And I really liked your graphics and everything. What is your idea? How would you organize that kind of space incubator if I would come and just say I need 800 square feet or 8,000 square feet? How would I pick my place, and how would I find a catalog of things to do or building materials? How would that work? Because right now it looks like an open structure with two encased incubators. Sorry for those stupid questions. Maybe I was just not getting it, but I'm curious about that.
No, yeah, could you rephrase that just a little bit, that question?
No, let's just say, I mean, the work that we saw before, we were all, you know, thinking that, you know, to leave stuff open, but also to create this catalog of possibilities. You did create these two incisions, or these two incubators, I would call it. And you're saying everything is free in the levels in between, but is there a method of how much space can I invade? What can I do with it? Do you have a vision about that?
Yeah, you know, I think the vision was to celebrate this existing structure, really, and not go to the immediate easiness of demolition that I think we're so accustomed to in this development, the development world that we use. So looking at this space as not a leftover, but kind of a place to just really understand, you know, use it as you will, use it for you know, skateboarding, use it for biking up and down the ramp, use it to get to each one of these pods in a more, you know, scenic way than you would as if just going up the elevator core. So really focusing on the experience and the understanding of the existing, I think, was the goal. And then really leaving it up to the user to find a space to read, find a space to meet with a group, you know, have lunch, really anything that they would like to enjoy in this landscape.
It's like a huge stacked public park, and anything can happen. So you're not planning on anybody invading the place or putting a facade or putting any limits to it. So it's more like a circulation with a public place, or let's say a a park, a stack park involved, right?
Right. Yeah, you could think of it as like a vertical park that's without the grass. So.
Okay, good. Thank you. No, I'm not going to ask for the sun study for this.
Alex, thank you for the presentation. And I thought that your project is really provocative also in terms of creating like a different strategy or maybe a different framework on how do you deal with these abandoned structures. You were mentioning earlier as part of kind of like this circular logic about how you're choosing you're talking about selective destruction, selective demolition rather, right? Uh, Maybe can you explain a little bit further how you, like in this particular project, like how did you select which part of the existing structure to demolish, right?
Exactly.
What kind of parameters did you maybe set up for yourself to then determine? Because I understand like you were talking about like how you earlier talking about the path of the hurricane and so on, but maybe can you just explain a little bit more?
Exactly.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so that is something that we talked about quite a bit actually throughout the semester, kind of where these volumes are placed, how they're accessed, what is their connection in program to their immediate exterior, one facing I-10, one facing the lake, one facing downtown. And what ended up happening is, yes, the hurricane winds were a major thought in this project. After visiting the site, after visiting Lake Charles, even, well, I mean, I visited this semester and there was still just a really crazy amount of destruction that was still prevalent, and it was all on the eastern sides of the buildings. So, that just being extremely clear, visual to me, I think was a driver in this. So focusing that heavy, largest mass in that most protected corner, giving the office space management like the closest access to the circulation core, and then having this special place that overlooks the lake, finding these moments of connection and what would really benefit this existing building and make it something special. So I think there's probably a few ways that this could have been done. They could have been a little bit larger, a little bit smaller. But overall, it was definitely an idea of protection with, this existing building from the westward storm, but also really incorporating these key visuals of this surrounding landscape.
And I think the reason why I asked that also is that because can you go back to your the circular logic or the diagram of the sustainability or something about like how this one, right, the adaptive system that you're proposing is that because the selective demolition is somehow like one of your key new, like a new idea that then is distinguished from the closed system that you are then creating an alternative for, right? And so when you're just explaining now that the kind of driver in which like you selected those different corners as based on like the vista and potentially like a hurricane, one thing that struck me though is that it wasn't really based on, like for example here you're saying that it's the weathering damage that's sort of um, in a way driving like the corner that's being taken away or being demolished, right? So maybe that's something that you need to maybe either explain a little bit more or maybe to clarify in terms of not just because of like how it's connected in the visa, but rather because it's something about inherent about the abandoned structure that then allows you to select certain parts, like is it about the most damaged part, is it about the kind of the material that's the most degraded, the decaying part, right? Is it about the area that's the most protected, about the subtropical? But maybe you can clarify that further, because I think that's also where the possibilities and the potential of your project to somehow also help other, because that's what you're arguing, is that then maybe this could be, you know, maybe a model for other projects where this sort of degradation is also happening, and then what can you do with it, right? So I think maybe that's something that you can maybe explore further in terms of the parameters of how that selective demolition will happen. And I'm guessing there's something there that maybe you haven't really realized yet, but I'm curious about aside from those kind of corners, other parts that you can then also then demolish. And I don't know if you have a sense right now of like kind of beyond those sort of three moments, are there other opportunities that you're thinking that maybe just you didn't have enough time to explore? I'm curious.
Yeah, no, we did
To put it more bluntly and not so mildly, we would like to ensure, the idea is very good, we'd like to ensure that your building doesn't look the way it looks now just by accident, because you find it nice and elegant and with nice proportions. But the idea of, I'm not sure whether I like the word selective demolition. I mentioned before about the Alaskan project, the idea of reuse. So the regenerations, there must be a driving force in this regeneration. We would like to make sure that the final design has really something to do with a true logic of the building and what it has been through. And it's not just a sort of aesthetic stance like, okay, I'll remove the corner because I find it nice. There should be, I'm sure it's there, but we should feel a little more in your presentation the sort of driving force that makes the reconstruction, this sort of circular destiny. There must be a very strong driving force behind that, and not just design by accident.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that we were going back and forth between that quite a bit actually throughout the semester. More towards, I think, the beginning, but you know, where does the mass go? How much do I take away? Do I keep the whole building and celebrate the entire structure? Do I build something outside of it, not touching it at all? You know, how do we understand this existing mass in a way that, you know, makes the user have an experience in the new development? So definitely everything you're saying makes a lot of sense. But yeah, there's that came up quite a bit. So yeah, taking away versus adding, you know, where does that come in? And I think what I did end up on was only taking away the portions where I would be adding back. So deterring away from.
Then it's sort of architectural or aesthetic choice, and nothing that has to do with potential damage to the building. You're just cutting out the shape where you would like to add something. We don't feel the sort of intrinsic driving force that says, okay, this has to go because maybe it's fragile or something. It's not just a matter of choice because it's nice, it looks good. There should be maybe a more powerful driving force. Maybe it's there and I didn't get it, but the idea is very good and you shouldn't stop halfway.
Yeah. I have to intervene here and take responsibility for the selective demolition term because
it's not your fault.
I'm always, you know that it's always.
We're all curious now.
So, and I hear what you're saying, Eve. I mean, it's ideally you want to say that you're intervening where the building needs to be carved out, or there are some structural damage or something like that. But also, you can't deny the aesthetic qualities of of a project like this, and you can't just say it's this is where we need to do it, and it looks like a monster at the end, but it's okay because that's that's the logic that we're pursuing. So there is always a fine line in any design where there are the objective reasoning behind something, and there is the subjective decisions that you make along the way, and say it is a structure of a certain proportions, and you're adding to it. And then how do you intervene? And I mean, there is an entire, you know, if you look at different architects and how they operate, you know, from Shop in the meatpacking district and their project, the residential project, in that addition that seems kind of unbalanced, and there is aesthetic qualities to that. Or when you look at Renzo Piano and how he does some of his work of additions. So there are multiple ways of approaching this, or even, you know, Herzog Dimron in so many of their projects.
I don't deny it at all. And it looks good, but why does it look good that way? And why doesn't it look good with a bigger brown cube, or if it were more to the left? And I find this this page very interesting, but there's this idea of selective demolition. And so in Alex's mind, what are the criteria for choice and for selection? And
Right.
I'm just trying to encourage her to move forward and be really, excuse my French, have big balls.
Yeah.
And say, that's my choice. I'm doing this. I feel that I'm cutting this here and here because blah, blah, blah. The idea of selective demolition, if it's not just the result of the damages from the weather, this selection must be very well constructed and well,
Grounded, very well grounded in its. Yeah.
Be brave, don't be shy, and say it with your guts.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I jump in a little bit? I mean, so I'm not opposed to aesthetics, right? And I think at any project on a certain level, aesthetics are going to come in. But I think there's a bit of like I don't know what I want to call it, maybe a trick. I feel like if it's billing itself as what I was understanding to be like a material study, and then there's an aesthetic solution, it's like the two parts don't go together. So if we're really serious and rigorous about this material study, and we come up with, I loved Ruth's phrase earlier, a catalog of possibilities, and then we start to make aesthetic choices from there, or it's an aesthetic project altogether. I also want to say, like I find, just like everyone else, I find this drawing totally convincing and compelling. I don't think that the project answers what this drawing proposes. And my hunch is that, like, the place that I feel like is a bit of a misstep is the moment that program comes in. It's like all of a sudden you're designing it's like you have this really compelling diagram, and then all of a sudden this is where the theater is, this is where the restaurant is. And I feel like these big blocks are coming in to support or to kind of capture that program. And I really see it as a project that is, like, first and foremost a kind of material study. I also think there's this diagram suggests that it's kind of a formal project, but not formal in like the Eisenman sense, but again, like somehow coming back to that material sense. And my final thought is, I also think that there's like two different solutions in a way that this diagram suggests. So one, I think, is like the building that you're intervening was designed for the closed system. So there's like the closed system building and then adapting to its destruction. And then I wonder if there's like, you can't do two theses at once, but if there's another project that's like, if we're not starting out with closed system designed buildings, what would be a building that's designed with a kind of adaptive mindset already in place from the beginning?
Yeah, that's definitely something to think about. I know there's it started very differently. I think I was just so, kind of like taken back and intrigued by this structure. And I was just like, what can we do with this? What do we do with these similar structures along the coast? And how can we not create more waste? So, all the feedback, everything makes sense. And it's all definitely interesting to move forward and think about again. So I agree. And I appreciate that.
I mean, tied to this idea of, like what is being removed and replaced and how much, is the question of, when do you find the right balance, right? Or how do you know that 3 cubes is enough cubes? When like, is this the final step in the process? Or, so how do you calibrate the answer to that? And one way would be to be more intentional about, where the cubes are placed and why, which might have to do, as you're setting up your thesis, material degradation. One thing replaces another, right? There's other ways to think about it, right? I mean, if you think about it more, conceptually, right? Maybe over time, the structure gets overtaken by cubes, right? By new elements, right? By new components, right? And gets replaced through this new architecture, through the new materiality, right? So what you're showing is just, a step in the process and not a final product. Initially, we had discussed different approaches, where the actual garage would be left alone, and one would become a witness to the material degradation, from the point of view of a new structure, for example. But right, so there's a dialogue between that. So I think, again, conceptually, there's different ways this could have been addressed. And again, this doesn't necessarily have to be, right, the final product, or one could say, okay, this is exactly what I want it to be, with that intention. And this is the exact placement because of this and this and this. And, this is the right program, right? So you can be either very specific and intentional about it, or you can consider this as something that is much more open-ended than it seems to be.
Alex, one thing that I'm also reminded now, because of this idea of degradation and the weather damage, is that then what you could also maybe do, and maybe this is for the portfolio, is that then you add more perspective drawing showing how it's degrading over time, and then maybe the Corten steel cubes. I'm reminded of Piranesi's illustrations, and his drawings, and how the Corten box remains over time. Maybe there's like moss growing over it over time. It's so pristine at the beginning, and then you have succeeding perspective drawings where then the other parts, like the concrete, are slowly decaying, and that therefore, because I'm reminded of what Ruth was also mentioning earlier, it's like, then what happens to that interstitial space between the Corten boxes? So is that also decaying over time, and how does that work, and what that could experience be like? So maybe you have over, like a series of perspectives over time, that maybe then it's like a la Piranesi, kind of like the end where you have the ruins of the garage, and then you have the Corten steel also somehow still standing or sticking up, or something, and I think that might be a good sort of continuation of your speculation, because it is very rich.
That is, yeah, that's I looked at a lot of his work, so that's funny that you say that. That was definitely an inspiration, like just the whole process of decay and degradation, and looking at this as very much a material study, but trying to make it, an overall design thesis as well. I think that is a compelling thing that I'd be really interested to look into. What does this look like in 50 years, and how does this grow and deteriorate as a system? So that is very intriguing.
Okay, great. Any other comments? No? Good. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. I appreciate all the feedback.
Thank you, Alex.
We have Lizzie next.
Hello, my name is Lizzie, and I will go ahead and share my screen. All right. Hello. Yeah, as I just said, my name is Lizzie. My thesis is titled The Renewable Public Landscape, Exploring the Integration of Wind Turbines in Lake Charles, Louisiana. Here. So to begin, I think it's important to set not only the physical context, but also the theoretical context of the proposal, which begins with the United States' reliance on petrochemicals being detrimental not only for the planet, but also completely unsustainable. Louisiana is a heavily burdened petrochemical state with entire town economies rooted in extraction of oil and gas and production of basic chemicals. And as you can see, it's billion-dollar industries that we're talking about. And Lake Charles is one of these towns. As you can see here, the landscape is really littered with petrochemical production. And the industry is, however, though, the industry is fated to soon be obsolete with the rise of clean energy production. However, public perception of renewable energy in towns like Lake Charles can be largely negative, as demonstrated by the Not in My Backyard movement, which these comments touch upon. However, the public perception must transition along with the physical reality of the American landscape as we move into a more sustainable future. And this thesis intends to combat the negative perception of renewables through the deployment of large-scale wind turbines in public space. As fossil fuel production is replaced by renewable energies, the American landscape is destined to change alongside the economy of the country and these small towns. This thesis is an exploration of the spatial and perspectival experience of wind turbines as they're integrated into the public realm of Lake Charles, Louisiana. And this drawing demonstrates the concept of American monument and infrastructure and how wind turbines would look in comparison to that. On the right, you have some pieces of infrastructure and aesthetic pieces as well, such as the large crosses that are directly on or surrounding the site in Lake Charles, and then larger American iconic monuments, rethinking how do wind turbines fit into this picture. So using the North Beach in Lake Charles really is a testing ground to better understand the potential for future integration in the built environment. I began my investigations treating the wind turbine as a site in and of itself, exploring the many scales and interventions that are possible. On the left, the upper left, you see the base condition of a turbine in an otherwise blank landscape. And I would like to point out that that is not mandatory or inevitable, but is instead just the beginning for how we can think about integration into the built landscape. Could it be that the turbine is the future chimney fireplace, is the hearth of a home? It could be an entire neighborhood community organizer. Can we rethink the glorification of the public monument? These examples operate in a theoretical sphere, but I have chosen a few to further interrogate on site. So Louisiana as a state is currently ranked 3rd out of 50 for the highest potential to harness wind energy production. And actually, as of November 9th in 2020, the governor, John Bell Edwards, announced a renewable energy initiative for the Gulf of Mexico with plans to harness Louisiana's strengths in offshore energy production for the development of wind power, which is the nation's #1 source of renewable energy. And thinking along those lines, I'm actually proposing that turbines are placed closer to the city. So here, 20 turbines are placed in the lake of Lake Charles, with several creeping onshore the existing North Beachfront. The turbines are rethought of as more than merely pieces of infrastructure and are instead showcased here to cultivate familiarity and favoritism with the local population. This beach is then wholly rethought as more of a productive public landscape, promoting a more sustainable future for the city of Lake Charles. As you can see, the turbines are placed on a 600-foot by 600-foot grid, which is the standard placement for commercial turbines. And they will produce in 1 year enough power to provide energy to 1/3 of the homes in the area and replace 50,000 barrels of crude oil and save 270,000 metric tons of carbon from entering the atmosphere. I'm actually going to pull up a GIF now okay, great. So the site logic is first determined by the 600-foot distance between the turbines. Next, the turbines break from this rigidity and are rearranged to create spatial interest in a more dynamic site condition by pushing and pulling them along the grid path. Following the turbines are the connecting pathways, which really sequence visitors through the site and provide the spatial experience at the turbine sites. And then lastly comes the building, the piece of architecture, which acts as a backbone against the interstate and a visual barrier between the interstate and beach, providing technical and educational programming while also carefully controlling the perspective and experience of each turbine. I'll minimize this now, move forward. So looking at the plan, you can see the 5 turbines as they are arranged across the site. They are 370 feet tall, which is massive compared to a 6-foot person, and 14 feet wide at their base, with the rotor blades spinning in a diameter of 240 feet. The program for the visitor center is largely split between education, changing facilities, technical spaces, and also exhibition. Moving forward, I'll be showing in further detail turbines 2, 3, and 5. So the second turbine is thought of as a pier integration. This spatial arrangement incorporates the turbine as an addition to the typical boardwalk. So seating surrounds the base, encouraging pedestrians to sit and enjoy the views of the beach and the lake. And there's also a direct connection made from the entrance of the site as you slowly ramp down. And your view is really framed by the architecture on either side, and a very strong 1-point perspective is created, framing the view. The other turbines also slightly fade into the distance, and this one is really highlighted. Looking at the third turbine, this investigates the relationship between building and turbine. There's a gentle ramp inside, taking the visitors down to a sunken base, allowing a condensed courtyard host a massive turbine, kind of playing with the idea of scale and realizing that from the inside, looking out into the courtyard, you only see the base. And so you have a complete rethinking of the human body next to a turbine, as it's the only piece visible. However, once you step out, again, the large scale is emphasized as a dramatic angle is needed in order to see the full turbine. Just again, promoting or visualizing the scalar difference. And then lastly, this 5th turbine on site incorporates vertical circulation as it wraps around the turbine, lifting visitors to new heights and providing views of the entire park and lake. It's also situated in a plaza, which is interesting, but has a similar ramped condition as the 2nd turbine. However, it is not situated in a perfect, strong 1-point perspective, and is seen as actually more like a piece of infrastructure or a strange object in the landscape upon first glance. So in sum, this project is a manifestation, just one, I think, of a larger concept of integration of turbines into the built environment. And these pieces of infrastructure hold so many opportunities to be celebrated by the public through architecture. And I hope that this thesis has aimed to do so coherently. Thank you.
Thank you, Lizzie.
And these are some of my final slides.
I have one first question, certainly just a detail very down to earth. I understand your inspiration coming from these, and we already imagine the way it looks. I mean, this sort of mirror, the lake as a mirror with the that field of wind turbines. I'm not raising the question of the extra cost of building them on the water, but one of the reasons why people, as you recalled in your slide 3, people have this sort of not in my backyard thing. One of the motives for the rejection is actually the noise that these make. It's not just because they are very much there in the scenery, in the landscape, but also because they generate very low frequency sound, which drive people completely crazy in the long run. So is it something that you're aware of? Are you a sadist, or do you think it's part? No, seriously. Do you think it's part of the experience, and you say, okay, it's okay, because now you're offering a sort of recreation area, public space. So do you say, the way it looks, the show is worth it, and I imagine that people can stay there for like 1 hour, because for 1 hour you can you can resist and stand it, and it becomes like an obsession after a longer time. Do you play with that? Are you aware of that, or did you just show it away, or is my question totally pointless? I told you, it's just a down-to-earth question about the detail, and I'm not underestimating the general concept, which we can discuss too, and which is very interesting.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad for the comment. So the turbines, they on average are
because obviously you are you even have a turbine above your head, the way so you're living with a turbine above your head on a 24-hour base. So maybe you're not being very objective.
Oh, that's true. I
sorry, go ahead, Lizzie. It's just
times, but I would say so. The turbines, when they're running, there's a steady stream of air. Their sound is at around 50 decibels. To put that into perspective, your average office environment is about 70, and the average household refrigerator is about 40. So there is a noise that is created. However, unless you are, I think that the negative perception of the sound does come from people who are concerned about putting one on their own property and the sort of like prolonged exposure. And I think that was why I thought about putting affordable housing on this site. But I think one of the key components is that it is it's more of a commercial and a civic programming, which is not 24 hours, to be honest. And also, considering that the site itself is fairly windy, it's already a little bit loud in and of itself. And I think that that's very common with typical beaches. You hear the waves crashing a little bit and the wind blowing. And I think that it is not as maybe of like a dramatic effect as people would think upon first hearing it, because I think that is the typical first reaction is, oh, well, the sound. But I think that that's actually more of like a cultural like myth, and one of the main reasons why people are afraid of them.
Okay. And if I might add to Eve's question, here we have them a lot, over in Germany, and especially when the wind is high, it's so loud, like it's insane. So you have the windmills running against the ocean, but I don't think you will hear the ocean anymore. So maybe we should talk about the architecture and what you were planning there. I mean, clearly having windmills is a good thing and maybe a thing for the future, but you're also showing us, these big ramps, and you're showing us this kind of sidewalk. I would be interested in how you want to get this all together. I mean, is it a leisure path, or how do you see the windmill and this kind of harbor mall? How does it go together?
Just as a conclusion, which doesn't call for an answer, Lizzie, you cannot deny that there is sort of whoosh, whoosh, whoosh constant thing. And so I wish you would come to a point when you wouldn't say anymore, it's even less noisy than your fridge. I would like you to integrate this in your project to the point of saying, yes, I know, and it's part of the project, and there may be a sort of fascination coming from this, which adds a sort of bodily dimension to your project as an architect, creating a sound environment. I would encourage you to play with it, being aware of it, and take advantage from it instead of saying it, well, a fridge is noisier. Because you can turn it, this problem, which is real, you can turn it as an element of the overall experience, I guess. Sorry about that.
No, I'm grateful for the comment, and I would be inclined to agree. I believe, Ruth, your question was about the pathways.
No, the architecture. I mean, I can totally see what you're trying to do with the windmills, but you also created an architecture, and it's like this lined up thing, you know, it's like this linear thing. And I just would like to know, how does it connect to the ocean, I mean, or the water and the streets, and how is it a layer in between? What is, I mean, you're lining up these buildings, and what is happening in these buildings? Because I saw the mills, but I'm more interested in what you did on land.
Right. So here I can actually maybe we'll stay in the plan. So originally, I thought about the building as this physical and visual and sound barrier between the beachfront and the interstate, which is right here. And you currently access the site through this access road, which comes along here, and then you can pull off for parking and direct access to the building.
And it's also loud, right? I guess the interstate, no?
Yes.
Okay.
It's not.
Eve, make your choice.
No, it's not just about making a choice. I think there's a sort of thickness in the area, which also has to do with the sound, the interstate, the turbines, etc. And I wish that this thickness of the sound would be, there would be a sort of strong awareness of this in the project. This would add to the architecture and to the overall experience. But well, maybe it's just a fancy of mine. It's just a fancy of mine.
But maybe Lizzie is telling us what she's doing with the building, and maybe it's exactly doing that. So Lizzie, you again.
Yeah, so I think that the idea was to create not only a visual barrier and a separating space, but also an acoustic barrier as well. That's why concrete was chosen as the building material, because of its absorptive properties, as opposed to, you know, a wood construction or maybe even steel. I think originally too, I was playing with the idea of enveloping the architecture in sort of more of an earth covered condition. But I did step away from that due to flooding concerns. But no, it's a fair point to raise, I think.
Lizzie, I'm fascinated by your approach in terms of integrating the windmill with the architecture. I thought that it was really provocative. And what struck me is that you're almost like creating a narrative, right? You're talking about the perspectival view and the experience as you go from one windmill to the other. One thing that I'm curious, because you were just to clarify, is this you said this is a visitor center?
Yes, the program of the building is a visitor center. It has also education, you know, it has lecture halls and classrooms, also some mechanical spaces and changing facilities for the beach. Currently on site, the only buildings are 2 public bathrooms on either end. So I wanted to build up the program.
But it's also an education. Are you proposing a very specific sort of educational program, or is this related to the windmills themselves as an education?
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked. I forgot to mention the education would be around renewable energies in general, but also specifically on the functions of the wind turbines. And it would act, you know, this entire site in my mind has been all about a demonstration, right, for the rest of the country, for the state, for the city, about integration and about the efficacy of turbines. Why, you know, they're not only, you know, perhaps crucial for our moment in time, you know, as a planet, but also could be more easily digestible by the local community.
Right. And I think that's why you're also then choosing these sort of different moments with the 3 windmill as part of this didactic process, right? Like because you're teaching whoever's visiting. And so in on that line, I'm curious about, so then what would those three moments teach you, or somehow how does it fit in the narrative of like, so why one point perspective versus the other one that's kind of like a different perspective, and then the ramp, the spiral lamp, how does that fit in kind of the narrative of what it's supposedly trying to say? I'm curious.
Yeah, I think that I was thinking about it. I guess I'll go, turbine by turbine. So the second one, Lake Charles is a fishing town. When I went to go visit the first time, it was a beautiful sunny Saturday afternoon, and there's this public, boardwalk that goes along from the beach down to downtown, and there were a lot of people fishing off of it. And piers and the boardwalks are kind of typical for this area. And so this first integration was thinking about, all right, we're taking a typical piece of, architecture, infrastructure. How would you integrate a turbine into that? So how would you make it one with, sort of the local vernacular? And the strong 1 point perspective is set up on that because that's playing off of the boardwalk itself. I think it's a long, skinny, typically perfectly straight piece of public infrastructure. And
take a sip.
Cottonmouth. And so I thought that was sort of like a natural transition into the perspectival experience. Whereas the third one, I thought it would be a really exciting opportunity to play upon the fact that, wind turbines are so kind of iconic in their appearance and recognizable, but what happens when you isolate just the base? And I think that that's what happens when you put it into a building inevitably, unless you were to place it on the roof or integrate it into a facade somehow, which other buildings and proposals have done. So the last one, I think, is more about the vertical circulation, and also thinking about it as more of this like strange object in a landscape. The interior of the turbines actually has a ladder for maintenance purposes. However, that's not a public experience. It's not a typical availability to people who would be visiting the site. So I was interested in creating a public pathway that would at least mimic that experience a little bit by taking a visitor up and providing views and really being able to, going around, I think, in a circular motion. You can only go up so high. You can't go anywhere within 30 feet of a blade. But yeah.
Because like I appreciate like what you're saying about the different perspectives, and I'm wondering also, you have three moments that you're identifying, and each one offers like a different view and also like a different experience, and also sort of saying like, okay, one is about integrating it with a boardwalk, so which means like you're saying like, oh, it's okay, we can still fish even with it being here. And then somehow then like here in the third, it's also saying something different, but all three are still very disengaged in the sense like you're building away from it, right? You're still not touching it. And I'm curious like why that is the case, where if it's integration, would there be like an opportunity? Because like you were saying, is exactly like, okay, there's a ladder inside, but wouldn't it be interesting also where maybe this particular turbine, maybe the structure is something that people can actually go in. So it's designed in a different way, but then it sort of adds to the kind of narrative, like where, because all of them, you're just experiencing it from the outside. And maybe at this particular moment, maybe there is a different experience, as people go through the St. Louis Arch, or even going up to, like the Duomo in Florence, you go through the kind of, it's such a different experience. And because all three so far, they're still from the outside. So I wonder, like, maybe that's an opportunity where the third one, or maybe, 3 out of the 5, maybe the fifth one or something becomes sort of a different experience. Again, like the reason why I'm asking this is that to really sort of, one, create this narrative of what the different maybe strategies of integration within the architecture, whereas you're outsider looking in, and then maybe that's why I'm thinking like, okay, what's still missing is kind of like an inside looking out, or as a sort of a different moment in this experience. So it's something to think about, right? And I think I'm pushing you to create the moments a little bit more distinguishable, so that then it will encourage people to also like visit all 3 moments, or maybe extend to all 5, right? So but I think like it's very compelling, like how each one has a different objective, and then so to clarify that, I think which is good, and then how do you push that even further, right?
Yeah, and I appreciate that feedback a lot, and I think there was a little bit of hesitancy to do that, because I'm obviously not an engineer, and I would never want to, compromise the structural integrity. But I completely agree that I think starting off doing this, I have this mindset of, all right, as an architect, my role is not to redesign the turbine. It's about where the turbine meets the ground, right? That sort of like public space is the area at which an architect could intervene. And so I think as a default, I left a 3-foot ring around all of the turbines for, access and maintenance purposes. But I feel like if I were to be able to like study this for another 6 months, and really like interrogate the shell and the exact like assemblage of the turbines, it could be really interesting to like begin to directly.
But this is what we're doing here is not necessarily about being, having the technical knowledge, or, being super realistic about things, right? It's about being speculative and,
right.
Developing visions, right? That's what we've been talking about all along, right? So it's not, nobody would I mean, I don't want to say nobody, but the discussion shouldn't be about whether it's possible or not, but whether, what's the vision, right? What can be altered in regards to the existing circumstances, right? That offers, opens up opportunities, or, alternate ways of thinking about the existing condition. And in that regard, right? Possibilities, right? So that's really, so what you just said, right, is that's not how you should be thinking about this, right? You should always really, one should always think about the possibilities first before being bogged down by the realities of things, and
there's one thing, Lizzie, which I'm curious about. I totally share what Cordula and others said, and I'm going back to the noise thing, meaning that I see this project as it has to be a sort of bodily experience. And I see it, we see people running or skating or whatever. I see this architecture as something about movement. I mean, your wind turbines give a sort of scale and awareness of the scale of the landscape. They are moving and making noise, and these ramps, etc., suggest some movement. And I suggest you should keep working on something, your architecture not as a static element, but a very dynamic one. For example, I sent you 2 photos by a French artist who did what you do on this slide. And when I see this ramp like this, it reminds me of this video, I think we mentioned it maybe once with Amar, this video by Bjarke Ingels of the big studio in Copenhagen. And you will find very easily on YouTube his video, which he made himself, riding a bicycle along the ramp of his building. And then the building becomes movement. And so I think that what you're designing, whether it's feasible or not, or under which technical conditions, but try to think in terms, Ruth said it about accesses and those things, and the relationship with interstate, it becomes an element of big movement in the landscape. And I think you should foster that and reflect very much on how to make people move, or how can these become a sort of accelerator, like a particles accelerator. I think you should work. It's just my personal opinion, and others may just disagree completely. But with a sketch like this one, it suggests the idea of movement, and you should really think, I think, about that movement, noise not as a negative thing. I mean, call it music or a sound environment. Okay, music, sound, movement, etc. is something that goes along with your project and which your project should channel and implement, I think. And in the process, I say this, of course, under the supervision of your professors, who may say, Eve, shut up, this is nonsense. But I think you should explore this, and as architecture at the core of that, but architecture at the core of an environment which you offer to people with a sort of overall body and senses experience. And then architecture makes sense. And you're being an architect as you're doing that and playing with all these. This is a material for architects.
And Lizzie, also looking at some of your diagrams, they were mostly the floor plans, and there were some interconnections between your windmills, and there clearly some of them are sitting in the water, and I don't even want to know what kind of foundation you have to drill down there, and how many divers are involved, and the whole thing. But it's not about reality, right? So, but I mean, you sort of created this network around your building, your linear building, and I think there's so much potential that clearly the time was too short, but you could figure out and just think in terms of the noise and how high are they and how far are they away and where's the wind coming from and at what time and whatever. And I think they can also influence whatever you're doing there. But I also want to recommend you for your graphics. I think they're very consistent. They're very nice. They're, you're clearly into windmills, which, you can see critical, but also it's part of the future for alternative energy gain. And so I want to recommend you for your project. Even if we say all these things, we just want to follow you through and think further. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I'll jump in. I think, Lizzie, I also want to commend you on the project. My comments are kind of on 3 different levels and they're kind of interconnected. So on a kind of logic or premise level, on a design level, and then on a kind of idea level. I think on the logic kind of premise level, it's totally convincing. The premise makes sense. Those early diagrams. I love the diagram with the windmill or the turbine and as the hearth or as the community. I think it captures the idea or the premise of the project really well. And I guess likewise, I will just reiterate that the sensibility in the drawings is really lovely and it carries throughout the whole project and there's a cohesion. So I think on this logical premise level, it's like absolutely successful and convincing. At the same time, I definitely feel myself, I think like others are saying, like wanting more, which I think is a sign of a good project, not a criticism. On the design level, so when I see the kind of, well, on one hand, like this diagram sets up a kind of singular instance of the turbine, this turbine, that turbine, each as a kind of center of a different idea. But you're really dealing with this kind of immense landscape of turbines and the kind of cumulative effect of all of them being together, both visually, bodily, in terms of acoustics, like they're all moving. Is the sound even more amplified because there's, I forget how many of them are out there, 90 or something. And so, yeah, I think that in some ways, like as much as I find this diagram convincing, it also gives a kind of false premise of the actual landscape that you're dealing with. And then when we get to the park design, it's not really a park, I guess, but I'm calling it a park because it's reminding me of Parc de la Villette, and it feels a little formal and like one slice of that. And it's not a, it's not like a bad way to go, but I think that the comments today are really making me think that like a Baroque garden would really do you well in terms of like how one moves through space and this kind of dynamism and attractors and kind of compression of space and an opening up of view. And so in some ways, I'm feeling like a Baroque space could be an interesting way to look into it if you had more time. And then I guess finally on this kind of idea level, I definitely agree with Eve. I think that when I look at the design, it looks, I mean, both the kind of the building itself and the perspective diagrams, renderings that you've made, it feels very domesticated. And I, on one hand, like we see these structures as like these alien things. And so I can kind of appreciate the idea to domesticate it and bring it into a more common view. But it also feels like it's not doing, it's not kind of honoring the alienness and the wildness and the kind of bodily experience that they offer. Yeah, and even that image of the kind of rendering with like someone taking a selfie, like it seems very safe and very tame, and like it's the new High Line, and we can all go there and take selfies, and I don't know, and have a kind of domesticated view of the landscape. Or it's this like crazy, you're faced with like all of these turbines and this like surreal landscape. And it doesn't have to be one or the other, but I think, spending some time imagining like what the more intense version, for lack of a better word, and the less domesticated version of the project could be fruitful. Yeah, and if those perspectives that you have, like if they move away from the engagement with the one turbine to views of like the landscape, I think would be interesting. I think having the one, can work and could be further developed, but I think it gives a bit of a false view of like the totality of the landscape that you're dealing with. Yeah. That's it.
I appreciate the comments, and I think it was interesting for me because, as I said earlier, I kind of started with the diagram, at least, entering the semester, studying wind energy and all of this other thing, all of the other aspects of the project, and it did become about how to take, kind of these independent scalar investigations and then apply them across a landscape, and I think that that's why the plan kind of operates in the way that it does, setting up these different moments. And I think that they might operate more successfully independently as opposed to connected into a landscape, which is, something that I would want to investigate further, I think. And, just being transparent, like that was one of the larger challenges, was, transitioning from that concept diagram onto the site.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Lizzie. That was good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lizzie, great.
Thank you. We have one more. Eitan, there you are.
Hello.
Hi, Eitan.
I'll share screen. Okay, so my name is Eitan, and my thesis is on creating a regional skyscraper. The thesis is basically a response to the genericism of contemporary skyscrapers. While most regions throughout the world have their own vernacular architecture or regional architecture, the elements that make these houses or housing typologies so unique often aren't translated into skyscraper architecture. And with so many cities expanding vertically, it's important that this changes. So my thesis statement holds that a great portion of modern urban development is constituted by the erection of glass and steel skyscrapers. These towers have contributed heavily to the carbon impact of cities and don't serve to capture the cultural moment of a place. Moving forward, we must create regionally unique skyscrapers that reflect a place's climate, physical environment, and socio-cultural context.
Eitan, do you want to share your screen?
Oh, wait, am I? Oh my God, is it not sharing?
No. I want to jump in.
Not much imagination, you know.
I wasn't sure if you're starting off loosely or.
Oh no, I thought it was shared. There was a whole diagram already. Oh man. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks for catching
Just restart.
That.
Just restart, exactly.
I
Start
will
from
restart.
scratch. Okay.
That is great.
No
Can we see it
worries.
now?
No worries. Yes.
All right, thank you. I'll start all over again. So the thesis is creating a regional skyscraper. And it's basically a response to the fact that contemporary skyscrapers are very generic. And while most regions throughout the world have their own regional architecture, or sometimes called vernacular architecture, the elements that make these styles so unique are usually not translated to skyscraper architecture, despite the fact that skyscrapers are the new housing typology in many growing cities. I guess I'll read it again. My thesis statement is that a great portion of modern urban development is constituted by the erection of glass and steel skyscrapers. These towers have contributed heavily to the carbon impact of cities and don't serve to capture the cultural moment of a place. Moving forward, we must create regionally unique skyscrapers that reflect a place's climate, physical environment, and socio-cultural context. The image in the center of this diagram is a photo montage by Luca Galaforo. And he began with a 1968 photo by Paolo Monti of a historical village house. And he basically reinterpreted it as a taller structure. So utilizing the same logic, but jumping scales to that of a contemporary skyscraper, I created the image to the right, which is my own photo montage, and it captures the concept of my project, which is to express vernacular architecture as a skyscraper. I chose Tel Aviv, Israel, as the case study for this thesis. And like many growing cities, Tel Aviv has tons of new skyscrapers. And it's interesting because the region has been utilizing local materials and passive strategies and very unique ornamentation for millennia, but unfortunately, none of these elements have segued into skyscraper architecture. In designing this project, I set out to create 5 points, which was in part inspired by Kenneth Frampton's 6 points for creating an architecture of resistance. And the idea is that these 5 points could be applied to any region that is developing skyscrapers, and that the results would be a skyscraper that's regionally unique to that place. So in Israel's case, or Tel Aviv specifically, I guess it's more of a regional thing. So it's the Middle East in general. So the material is either adobe from the Jordan River Valley or stone quarried from local mountains. And the form, which is directly a result of the materials available, are often arched openings and vaults. And this is because there wasn't sufficient wood for lintels in the desert, and oftentimes courtyards to aid in passive cooling and create shady outdoor areas. And technology is basically what allows these elements to become a skyscraper. So in the Middle East, that's typically reinforced concrete, which has a better heat rating than steel alone. Perhaps most interestingly is culture, and this is what varies greatly from region to region. And in Israel, there's a strong culture of shared outdoor spaces and street life, which often takes place in courtyards or more contemporarily just on the street in Tel Aviv. And lastly is ornament, which obviously adds an artistic level, an element to the design. And a lot of times this references culture, whereas other times it is born directly of the building material and sort of expresses the construction methods. And in the case with adobe, the stacked pouring of adobe kind of creates these striations that are ornamental. So the next couple images are actually just to kind of paint a picture of the life in Tel Aviv and the historical architecture. So these images are from Old Jaffa, which is the most historical part of the city. And you can see here that there's a strong language of material and non-orthogonal streets, winding streets. and this sort of non-planar elements where there are ups and downs. The whole thing is built on a slope. So that's very interesting. And then next is a series of images by Paul Margolis, and he's a local photographer in Tel Aviv. And these images are more contemporary, but they basically capture how even in the modern day, Israelis love to basically utilize outdoor spaces, play backgammon in the streets, work out, play music, or just hang out on their own. So the goal of this thesis was to extract some of these elements and bring them into modern skyscraper architecture. This diagram is basically a simplified version of Old Jaffa's map. And I extracted these courtyards, which is what you see in the exploded axon to the left. And they are at a variation of scales. And the largest courtyards are basically these fully public spaces where the community can gather, whereas the smaller ones are either semi-public, which it might belong to a few houses or just to a portion of the neighborhood, or they're fully private, meaning that they might belong to a grand residence. So on the right, I stack these courtyards, and the idea is that embedded within a skyscraper, these spaces would create a modern village within a skyscraper. These are a series of study models in their late phase. They look quite similar to the final result, but the idea is that the language of arches and a series of courtyards throughout the building is consistent throughout. Finally, here is the proposal. And you can see that there is the introduction of the local material, which in this case is Adobe. And just to clarify, the building is definitely not built out of Adobe. It's the Adobe is used as the cladding material, which has a very high heat rating. It's actually better at keeping cold air in than either stone or concrete. And the idea is that it sits on this kind of vaulted outdoor space, which belongs to the community. Here in the elevations, you can see basically that, again, that the building sits on this vaulted space and that there's a secondary large space towards the top. And it's actually sloping west towards the Mediterranean Sea. So together, these two spaces, one which is fully public at the bottom and the other which is semi-public, open to all the building's residences, create the two nuclei outdoor spaces for the building. And there are these smaller private and semi-private spaces scattered throughout, as is denoted by the larger arches. I'll get into more detail with that. So here are the sections, and you can see further into those spaces. So there was a language of vaults that is consistent throughout all the exterior spaces, no matter the scale. And that is sort of one of the driving forces behind the design. This is the plan for the ground floor. It was created through a cluster of intersecting vaults, and it's fully open on four sides, meaning that it allows great airflow, which would cool the space in addition to the shade, which also cools the space. And it's complemented by a park in the back, which the geometries of the concentric circles are carried. This is the plan for the sky court. And this is the space that's sloped towards the sea, which I mentioned right before. And this is the space that's available to all the residents. And the language of intersecting vaults is consistent here as well, though it's a bit more regular than is on the ground floor. And there's a series of terrace spaces, which essentially allow views of the sea from any point. This would be a typical floor of the building. So pictured here are 5 residential units along with the building's exercise room. And the exercise room is complemented by one of those smaller semi-private courtyard spaces. And the idea is that there would be a few of these amenity spaces, whether it's an exercise room or a work share or a lounge, that are basically clustered near the main shared courtyard space. And they could be reached through the building's stair core. And to the right is this miniature index of the reflected ceiling plans of these spaces. So no two are alike, they vary in scale and in the way they're expressed. Oh, and I also wanted to mention that the limited aperture size and the thickened walls are part of the vernacular elements that help with heat gain and keeping the spaces cool in a climate that sometimes reaches 120 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a view of the inside of that sky court. So as you can see, any of the activities that might have been done on the street are being extracted and pulled into the space. So there's people playing instruments, painting, or just enjoying morning coffee. And the staircase that I mentioned that connects the secondary amenity spaces to this main one is expressed in the core of the space through a large parabolic arch. And finally, the most important aspect of the space perhaps is the sea. And you can see the striation of the material, which has that ornamental effect that I mentioned before. And the Boolean operations that were used to create the space created some very interesting vaults that could even be considered isometric ornament. Here's the park in the back of the building, and this is open to the entire city. And the circular geometries are basically carried out from the floor plan of that ground floor space. And it also offers a great view of the building itself. And this is the view from within that ground floor space. So you can see the grandness of those vaults. And once again, it's open on all sides. So the space would be very shady and cooled by wind throughout the day. And it would just be a great place for the community to gather or truly do whatever they want to do. And the concept was that instead of taking away space from the landscape, this building would actually add to it by creating another park for people to use. And here's basically a view from a room that's lodged within that space. So you have a vast view of the park and the vaults. And lastly is the building from the exterior, which shows its position towards the sea. And I just wanted to reiterate that the idea of the 5 rules was that they could be applied anywhere. So what's really elemental about this project is the material. It's the forms, which is arches and vaults. And it's the idea that we need to bring community space into buildings. So utilizing those 3 things, this building could have looked wildly different within those parameters. So thank you.
Thank you. Eve first, then
go
me.
ahead. Or just very briefly, just to say that I would like to know, as an introduction, maybe for the debate, what your instruments as an architect are. I mean, I was sort of carried away until you showed us the typical floor plan. And then I felt a sort of discrepancy, which I didn't expect. When we see your vaults, the big vaults like this public space, it reminds me of the models which Gaudi made for the Sagrada Familia, upside down with the little ropes. When I see this building, maybe the color suggested, I feel, and everything we saw, I saw it as sort of mass of clay, which you would have sculpted, where from which you would have carved out spaces, just a little bit like what Renkulas did with the competition for the Paris Public Library, building a dense mass of stuff and then carving out spaces. And I saw it almost as a sculpture, and I liked this idea, which was very consistent with your quotes from the little.
Oh no.
We might have lost him.
Yeah, he will come back.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ruth, the floor is to you.
Okay, no, I never wanted to be first, but I was just totally curious. I mean, I'm absolutely intrigued by your building. I have to say that, or your building design. What made you choose Tel Aviv, or I think it's Tel Aviv, Israel, as a site? Are you from there?
Yeah, my family is from there. I maybe should have mentioned that in the beginning, but I do have a personal connection with the site, and I've been there many times and spent a lot of time just observing the architecture there. So that's why I chose the site.
And all I can say is that I think I adore the country. Unfortunately, we don't have good news today because I think that they opened the bunkers again after they just conquered Corona. Now they might have a little war going on again, but I'm just saying that I think Tel Aviv is one of the most amazing cities you can experience. It's almost like it's a little bit like New York, and so I was super fascinated for your reason to pick that site, and so that was a super personal question to ask. Why did you pick Tel Aviv? And also, I think that very superficially, just from the outlook, amazing building. But I hope Yves is back by now and he can ask more critical.
I think you got my point. Sorry, I got disconnected, and I'm sure it's not Ruth's fault. I think you got my point. Is well, you will clear this out in our debates. Whether you're sculpting a shape and thinking from within to the outside, sort of carving out a thick thing, or not. I felt a discrepancy between the floor plan and all the rest of your discourse. But that's it. Ruth, please go ahead. I was disconnected for some good reason.
Yeah. You didn't want to hear what I had to say. No. All I had to say was that I really, just from the, from a superficial look, I adore the building. And clearly I was asking, Aitan for his reason to pick Tel Aviv. And he said that he has roots there and he comes from there because I'm very connected to Israel. I have a lot of friends there. Usually I go there twice a year. And, clearly we were supposed to be able to again, and now some other political problems are coming up. But I'm very close to their country. And that's why I was asking why Aitan picked that site. And while you were gone, he was simply telling me that he has relatives there too. And I also told him that from design-wise, just looking from the outside, that I very much am intrigued, but we need to know more about why and how he did it like that. And now back to you, Yves.
No, I think we have similar impressions, but I saw his building. I mean, he was his building looked as if he had designed it not with AutoCAD or with a pen, but with his hand. I mean, like sculpting it from a piece of clay. And I like this idea. If my feeling is good, and I wish this would be consistent all the way home. But it was just an introduction. Let's go back to the...
Yves, I'm curious a little bit to hear from you about you say the discrepancy in the plans and with the rest of the building. Eitan, do you mind going back to the plans and maybe Yves, you can elaborate a little bit about...
Yes, this is it. I mean, maybe there's a figment of my imagination, but when you see what is on the right, on the right-hand side, and this on the left, we didn't. I didn't expect to see. I mean, we see that there's a 20 or 30 centimeter thick, a 1 foot thick facade with its design, but inside we have a very regular orthogonal grid, and which I didn't expect to see when I see the things on the right. Or if you go back, Eitan, if you don't mind going back to the previous, some of the previous slides. Yes, that's those bubble. Next slide, the next slide, the one after this. Well, this is okay. I mean, we have this sort of waving shapes, and your first references, the photographs of the little white architectures on the left. When you said that you played and piled up your first sketch, general sketch, Eitan, which you showed.
This one?
The skyscraper. Yes, already this one and the previous ones.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, but I mean, we all have these in mind. We all have these in mind. When I see that, I mean, I could see you sort of sculpting sculpting models by sort of carving out shapes out of a piece of clay or whatever it is. And we would have expected more, I mean, maybe it's a figment of my imagination, but we would have thought of more organic spaces or shapes, a bit like in the style of Antilovag or people like that. Or if we go back to Israel Tzvi, and all of a sudden I find a little contradiction between this sort of very sensual movement and this typical floor plan, which could be the floor plan of any other building. But maybe there's no discrepancy, and maybe you can tell us about that.
Sure. Yes. Well, I do want to.
We would have expected a more organic extravaganza, three-dimensional extravaganza.
Yeah. No, I totally understand that, and I think I just want to first say that the project was definitely envisioned as a subtractive one, and I did envision it as a mass where, and it actually, even the process of designing it was really through subtraction. It was all through Boolean operations from carving space out of the building.
Subtraction, intrusion.
And sorry, I don't know if you said something, I missed that. But the thing is, when it came to the plans, I thought it was important to have this sort of rectilinear portion of the building that was sort of contrasted with these arched spaces. So I think this section is probably the best image to show in describing that, because you see these outdoor spaces that are carved spaces, and no two are alike. They each have their own personality, even though the operation is consistent throughout. And having those spaces tucked within the building that was optimized for maximum square footage is sort of where I drew the line. And I think the building could have been entirely organic, but I wanted to keep it at least somewhat realistic in terms of efficiency. So having these organic spaces contrast with the main mass of the building was basically the compromise, or if not the compromise, basically the relationship that was created.
I understand very well, but then maybe there's something interesting which happens if you look at the sketch, I mean the section on the left with a sort of big upper arched space. Then maybe what is most interesting is how you envision and negotiate the transition between those arched spaces and the typical floor plan. And maybe there's something interesting happening, you know, in the floor below the arch, or the ones above, and it shouldn't be just by accident a sort of cross section of an, of this sort of slope coming down. Maybe there's something interesting happening in these transitions, these in between spaces. There's something to negotiate between one logic and the other one. It cannot be. I understand very well the thing that, okay, you have to have typical floor plans, and the elevators must go up and down without meandering in between incredible spaces. But then if you have two logics like those big arches and ported spaces and the typical floor plans, maybe the idea of the transition is what becomes most interesting, because the little spaces in between. But well, I understand very well, but then
so
we know you can do it. We know you can do it and have fun about doing this and trying to make a sort of a transition, a logical transition, or a peaceful transition between two different logics, not just by accident.
And Eve, I think Laurie wants to say something too, but my little question would be, how did you integrate this thing in terms of urban context? How did you analyze that you could do a thing like that? Just not being from Israel, from Tel Aviv, you should better. How did you dare to do that? And we know that the building rights are very tough there too. And if you reconstruct an existing Bauhaus building, you can add 3, and you pay for all the structural reinforcement, you can add 2 to 3 tops on top of it. But you're doing this huge high rise. So did you do any research into that, or did you just pick a site and you went for it?
Yeah, good question. There definitely were some challenges associated with finding a site, especially because I couldn't physically be there. And that's a very good point that in the Bauhaus neighborhoods, they are not marked for buildings of this height. In some parts of the city, though, near Sorona Market, for example, there are these new towers being built that are up to 60 stories. And I think the truth is that this building wasn't actually envisioned to be so tall, but it ended up growing to this height just throughout the semester. It grew, and I did have a family member, a close friend of the family in Israel, actually help me find the site. So there was some attention paid to the site. I do think that I'm not very familiar with zoning there, but I think a building of this height is at least somewhat realistic in certain neighborhoods of Tel Aviv. I think it's possible.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to point that out.
Yeah.
In the end, it's always Cordula's fault, right?
No.
Yeah.
Or Almar's. I don't know who to blame.
Yeah, so I mean, I had a couple of just sort of like basic questions to begin with, which were like, one was, does every floor have the kind of courtyard space?
They don't. Definitely not every floor has one, and you can kind of see that in the elevation where there's floors that are skipped. And because of the nature of those courtyard spaces being usually double or triple height, if not 4 stories tall, there's probably an intersection of a courtyard at almost every level, but there isn't necessarily access to it.
Okay, yeah, I mean, maybe structurally or even programmatically, it's difficult to do, but I think that there's also this idea from that early diagram of kind of extracting the courtyards that exist sort of horizontally in the urban landscape and piling them up vertically, that there's kind of a democratic idea there that's not just formal, for lack of a better word, of dispersing those access to those spaces. So I was wondering just how much of that is in the skyscraper itself. And yeah, my other questions, I mean, my brain is just going to this discussion about the two logics and the like how the plan is expressed, and this idea of having two logics in the building. And I guess I just want to, put into the conversation that like if your project is about, on some level, identity, or at least this kind of regional attention to the regional detail, right? That the logic of the skyscraper as it is an economic logic. It's also intentionally a logic that doesn't care about identity and regional concerns and things like that, right? So I think that like juxtaposing these two logics within the building is more than just a kind of contrast or a formal idea. I think there's like really kind of political and social stakes in that. And so now that you've kind of started to reveal it through this conversation, more could be made of it. Yeah, I really love this diagram. I too sort of like thought I was following until I saw the plans. I guess I thought the plans would somehow not literally be this diagram, but would make me think of this diagram more. Yeah. And my other kind of, I guess, practical or not practical, I don't know, just sort of on the ground question was, I was a little unclear how the stair is working, because it looks like there's kind of a double stair in the plan and in the perspective.
Yeah, I can go to that. I think this actually makes the most sense in the section, but essentially the smaller courtyard spaces are either private, which means they belong to residents, or they're attached to a secondary amenity like the exercise room or the work share. And those secondary amenities are all kind of clustered near the main sky court. And I maybe just needed like another diagram to explain that. But you can see in the section that the core widens near the top, so that users could basically just elevator to the Sky Court and then get to the different amenity spaces through this more experiential staircase rather than the fire staircase. And that's why it doesn't carry all the way down, because below that, it's just private courtyard.
Yeah.
You can see that in the plan too.
Yeah, I saw it in the plan and I didn't quite know what to make of it. But then in the kind of rendering, I could see how it was working a little more. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Sky Court is the most like it to me, this is your idea and it's compelling. And I start to wonder if there's like, you know, 3 of these throughout the building instead of just the one, or yeah, I don't know. That's where my brain goes.
Yeah.
There's, to me, the interesting idea about this project is the relationship between private and public space, and this idea of the ground floor being the most public open space, and the sky lobby or court is kind of a semi-public space, and then the courtyards that are dispersed are more private. And I like what you were saying, Laurie, about this contradiction between the idea of a skyscraper and the kind of regionalism, or how, you know, almost this inherent contradiction in these two things. But the analysis of the area and the city and the region, and what the meaning of public space versus private space, and how these things are negotiated, and how you can take a project like a building and try to rethink the idea of the gradient between private and public spaces in one project. I think there's something, to me, that is quite successful in that sense. And the fact that I understand the kind of disappointment and for you and Eve in the floor plan, but also to me, it is trying to negotiate. What Eitan was saying is this kind of it's a project that is to some degree realistic, or want to be, and not want to push in, you know. So the question is, what is the agenda? And if you're questioning too many things in one project, maybe you're diluting the whole thing. So if we agree that the most important component is that notion of public and private space and how it's negotiated through a project, maybe to me that's the most interesting part of the project. And relying on more conventional floor plans and knowing that almost all of them, they have access to these more private courtyards, whether visually or physically, it becomes an interesting one.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think a couple of things. One is, I think, like, you know, my own brain, I can't help but think of Gaudi when I see this. And so I sort of expect a Gaudi-esque plan, and then I don't see one. And that's my own like historical bias and like
prejudice
on, yeah. And then I think like, even if there is a certain practicality, and again, one doesn't have to take this on in their thesis, but I think it's worth acknowledging that the logics of the typical kind of orthogonal skyscraper have a certain history and play a certain role.
Eitan, thank you also for your presentation. And you know, I saw your work during the midterms, and I'm really happy to see the progress and just leaps and bounds in terms of like what you're presenting today. So you know, I commend you for the development of the idea. And then I'm really drawn to these very elegant and really sexy. I find them very sexy, the way these arches are. And how you've reinterpreted it and kind of like looked at it in sort of different scales. So I'm really drawn to how and I think like your perspectives have really done a great job in creating the atmosphere of these public spaces. And I think that's why, like, when Amar, you were saying about kind of this relationship between the public and the private spaces, I think this is precisely because of how, like, you've been able to successfully create that sort of experience in these public spaces. um I'll come back to my question from the midterms, and it was about this issue of critical regionalism, Ethan, and then maybe you can remind us again, because like you were in your presentation today, you've highlighted again, material, form, technology, culture, and then ornament. And what struck me with then this iteration of your solution is that somehow um, not all of those 5 elements or 5 points are necessarily treated equally. And I don't think they should be necessarily treated equally, or that somehow, like, there has to be some form of maybe negotiation between the 5. And that's very evident in your work, because then the Adobe material, for example, really becomes more important. The public courtyards also became more important as a sort of an element. And then, the striation that you're talking about, the ornamentation. So I wonder, can you maybe just explain a little bit, like, what is then your attitude in terms of those 5 points that you're talking about, and really looking at it here as, because somehow, like, you're also proposing that this could be another way of I guess you said, you're proposing an idea of a regional skyscraper. And I think, like, for your particular context, certain elements or certain principles become more dominant over the other. So I wonder, did you think of it that way? That did you think of, like, certain things becomes more dominant versus the other? Because, like, you can almost flip this, right? Like, you can keep the outside as completely like, glass and steel, for example, but then the interiors really becomes that, like what Lori was saying, like, this very Sagrada Familia Gaudi-esque type of experience inside, but it sort of, the outside belies this inside. But then, because it's not about, you're not talking about the steel, or it's not about kind of like revealing that, and so you're sort of hiding it. That's one strategy. I'm not saying that should be your strategy, but because what you're proposing could definitely, it could lead you to many different permutations and variations. So I'm curious about this particular approach. Like, how did you decide, like, which of these 5 becomes more important or less important in your approach, maybe?
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a very important part of the project, actually. I think I'm going to refer back to this diagram, actually, because I made a lot of decisions using this. And as you can see here, the way it's laid out is that the words are on the far left, and that material, let's say, leads to form and leads to ornament. But ornament doesn't lead to anything. Ornament shouldn't lead to anything. So I think the idea is that I think I began with material because that's a given, and material can lead to form and it can lead to ornament, and form can lead to technology or ornament. But I think based on what leads to other things is sort of the hierarchy. So because material is not negotiable in the area, it became the most prominent part of the project. And I even, form, like the arched form, comes from the abilities of the material. And the striation, the horizontal striations in the Adobe are ornamental, but they result directly from the material and the construction method. So it was really material and form first, and then technology was almost a means to the end. Culture is sort of, it's the soul of the project. It's the courtyards. It's what was trying to be translated. And ornament is almost an optional 5th point. I'm personally very interested in ornament, and I think that it has a place in this project, but it was not the driving effect.
Well, because I will challenge you with that idea as well, right? Like, because then there are notions about identity. Is identity defined by, for example, environmental determinism, and because that's where, like, material as sort of the driving force can come in. Like, okay, because of Adobe dictates then the structure. But then how would you explain then all the other types of architecture across the world that maybe also uses Adobe, and therefore how would you distinguish, let's say, a Tel Aviv type of identity with that of the others? And that's why I know this is I'm not expecting you to answer, but I'm just wanting to ask you to think about the distinction also then of like, let's say, putting so much maybe weight on one thing, let's say material, and that therefore that's what's driving it. Because I would challenge you in terms of let's say regional architecture that's, let's say, wood, I mean, Japanese wood architecture and wood architecture that you find in, let's say, Finland. They're both wood and they're material, and yet somehow that the kind of the way they're looking at it is actually probably not driven by wood, but it's probably driven by culture or by technology or something else, right? So I'm just challenging you to think about in terms of what is really driving your sort of idea of this regional identity. You might need to unpack it more, and then but it's a great start. I'm glad that you're really identifying this, because I think that's it allows you to be able to explore the kind of possibilities, but just be more conscious in terms of like why you're choosing one over the other, right? Because you will always be challenged with that later on, right? So and your sort of definition of identity, for example, or regional or vernacular architecture is so complex also. So just I'm just kind of challenging you to think about that.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think the thing is that, the 5 points do all interact with one another. And if it was material alone, it's not enough, because you're absolutely right that, houses in Japan are built out of wood, but houses in Colorado are also built out of wood, and they look completely different. And I think that that's why having several points is so important, because whereas like Japanese architecture is mainly constructed through joinery or, like maybe using, I think, like tied elements, right? Whereas in Chicago, I mean, I guess Chicago, but I was saying Colorado, they use nails. It's sort of the technology, it's the culture, it's the material, it's really the amalgamation of the things and like the way they interact with each other that creates an architecture. Which is also why getting into the arches, like they could have been Roman arches, they could have been arches that like were asymmetrical, but the reason they're parabolic arches is essentially an artistic statement, and I think that there is a certain amount of artistry and architecture that did get lost, and part of this thesis was kind of calling for that to make a reappearance.
And that was my question that I had before. What's the context? Tel Aviv is one of the most amazing historic sites of Bauhaus buildings, and I think all you need to add is that you say, okay, and now there's Bauhaus, and I'm adding this to it for a specific reason. And I think your site is far from all the original Bauhaus sites, but I mean, there's so many projects going on to conserve the Bauhaus, because it's the only city in the world where so many buildings survived. And I think that's what we're asking for in the end, to also think about what's there, and is this a reinterpretation of the Bauhaus? Is this the new Bauhaus? Is this your Bauhaus? And this is what I would want you to answer, not tonight, but at one point in your portfolio.
Yeah, if I may comment on that, I think that from on my multiple trips to Israel, I think one of the things I was perplexed by is the presence of the Bauhaus and how much it's really admired. And of course, it should be admired. It's very interesting. As you said, it's one of the largest collection of these buildings in the world. But Bauhaus originated in Germany, and like the climate and culture in Germany is not exactly equivalent to that of Tel Aviv. And you see the issue where the earliest Bauhaus structures are completely falling apart, and they're trying to bring them back, but like I think the combination of the fact that they weren't built for the climate and they weren't really built with like local material in mind is sort of what led to their decay. And also they actually did a great job like in later phases, like the decades that followed the original houses, where you did start seeing overhangs, you started seeing smaller windows, and they tried to adapt, but it's almost kind of comical how like the original Bauhaus buildings, which were just designed by architects who moved to Israel from Germany or surrounding countries, really didn't fit there. So I think the project was almost particularly challenging because the quote unquote vernacular architecture that I was working with was from such an early period. It's from, you know, from old Jaffa. It's not from a few years ago. Like the regional housing style in Israel is, it's a little bit complex in that sense.
That's a good answer. Thank you.
Thanks.
Just one observation, Eitan, that I'm very slow because it's almost 1 o'clock here, 1 a.m. But I'm being slow and just reacting to something Amma said before. Surprising as it may sound, I listen to what people say, and Amma made me think about the status of public and private spaces. Going just back to the question, I was just thinking, if your courtyards, these sort of private courtyards connected to the some of the floors, could it be possible that they would become sort of interconnected with each other, almost like, you know, circulations in an ant farm, and they might become sort of network of circulation throughout the building, thus enabling you to have more freedom in your floor plans, because you wouldn't have to deal with emergency stairs and stuff like this. And maybe if your building would be sort of irrigated by a system of shared courtyards and public spaces, adding quality to the rest of it, being social spaces where people meet and have to interact with each other. Maybe your building would become sort of an ant farm or Gruyere cheese full of holes, and thus giving you more maybe freedom to have free floor plans. Just a question. It doesn't call for an answer now, but maybe if you think further about it, maybe that might be also a way of answering the issues raised by Amar about public and private spaces. Playing with both things and trying to make the most of apparent contradictions and turning your building into a sort of system, like a beating heart with blood vessels. Once again, it's pretty late here, so it doesn't call for an answer now. It's just a possible development for a future thinking about building, but it could become interesting.
Yeah. If I remember correctly, this was one iteration. There was an iteration of the project where that happened earlier on, and I think despite the fact that it's late in, you know, for you very late eve, it is a very good idea. But the reality of it is
potentially it's there.
I think the reality of it is much more complex than, you know, it sounds when you start creating all the kind of connections between these courtyards and access to light, natural light, and so on and so forth. But Eitan, maybe you want to answer this. I jumped in maybe a little bit too quick.
Sure. No, I agree with what you said, and I think probably Edson remembers, if you're on the midterm review, the iteration I had
exactly
like less than 2 months ago was actually exactly that, where the entire building was courtyards and they were all interconnected, and it was one space that sort of flowed in and out. And I think that the like throughout the design process, there was a point of departure where through a series of conversations, I kind of decided to make the building a little bit more like quote unquote realistic, in the sense of most of it being built out. And I think it was just as strong as it was as a concept, it was a little bit overbearing. And the question of like, why are there so many of these large courtyard spaces, and like, does there need to be this many, and like, how is each one used, I think kind of became a little bit muddled. And the solution was to have just a couple of these spaces that weren't necessarily connected to one another, but were visually related.
But I think it also has to do with your design process, right? Which was a little counterintuitive to what you ended up with in a way, because and that also might explain the floor plan situation a little bit, because you didn't address this building. We talked about this at some point. You didn't address this building as something that is, you know, carved out, right? Or like a piece of clay, as was said before, from the get-go, right? From the get-go, you thought about a thickened wall, right? And a series of you know, stacked floor plates, right? With a focus on the thickened wall, if I remember that correctly, right? So it was thought more about, you know, of like a kit of parts, or thought more of maybe in a more regular way, right? It wasn't thought of as a mass that is, you know, removed from, right? That, you know, like, I guess if you would have approached it from the get-go that way, it would have been easier maybe to incorporate this connected system of courtyards, you know, as a series of, you know, cavernous spaces, right? It is somewhat what you ended up with, but that's not how you set your design up to be in the beginning, right? And so I think that's where you stopped thinking about the interconnectedness, maybe because it was difficult to resolve to a certain degree. Right, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that's how I read your design process, right? And now that you're at this stage, right, you might be closer again to you know, where you could have been, you know, if this again was a carved out mass, and could bring that back, this idea of interconnectedness of the public spaces, the shared spaces.
I think that's where also, that's why my comment earlier about what is really driving your project, right? Like, for example, if because you mentioned the courtyard as one of the element, then is that the one that's sort of dominating, or is it about the exploration of the material? Is that the kind of idea? And so I think, Eitan, like you have to define what for us, of course, like, you know, in terms of like what is important to you, and I think it becomes evident now, you know, as we're discussing also how certain of those 5 principles then becomes more evident or more dominant versus maybe the other. So but very exciting. I mean, it's just very rich. That's why, like, there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of it might sound very controversial, but I think it's great, because then I think that's the strength of your project, is the kind of richness of it and the complexity of it, which then leads to all of these discussions.
And I would love to see it built, because it's really, I think it's an amazing looking building. But then in terms of depth, like how does the light come in and all of that, we don't question that today, I would say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to answer that, I think that was definitely like a main component of the design, where typically skyscrapers of any size are almost entirely glazed, whereas this one has these sort of punctured arched openings. And despite the way it looks, they actually are 6 feet tall. They're quite large, but the idea of having this limited aperture size was sort of a reference to the kind of traditional architecture of the region, but also a statement about how like glazed facades really don't make much sense in this region in terms of solar heat gain. So the combination of like the smaller windows and the thickened walls is part of that discussion, or part of that narrative.
Okay, but if we go back to the floor plan, and then I won't take you, you know, you just need to think about, okay. So they all get some light, and then you have a big core. Okay. I can see what you're doing. And also one last thing, I mean, the pattern that you put into this communal garden on every floor, that could have been so amazing if you would have transferred that on your floor plans. That would have been a thing that, you know, even Sarah hasn't thought about yet, and that would have been amazing. And not just in the garden, but, you know, all over the place. Like, not just having these, you know, straight walls and blah, blah. And we all know we need to have walls that stand above each other, and clearly the structures and the facade. But if you would have transferred the patterns that you show on the right-hand side that I only see transferred to the garden, if you would have done that in the floor plans, oh my goodness, what a project.
To have it throughout the floor plans, throughout the units.
Yeah. And just there's something there.
Yeah, I do not disagree with that at all. I think that could have been very interesting in a different way. But I think, again, it really was just this kind of contrast between having these courtyard spaces have basically contrast in the way they're architecturally expressed versus the more orthogonal or normal residence floors. So yeah, I think that definitely could be very interesting.
Great conversation, great project. Thank you, Eitan.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you very much. Are there any final comments in regards to the projects we discussed? Or
well done. That's all I can say. Well done.
I will say well done. The level of the work was so high and rich. I was really impressed with everybody. And I guess just because I'm one of the people who won't be here for tomorrow as well.
You're invited to come back if you would like.
Yeah, maybe I can pop in a little bit.
Sure.
But I just want to put out there, I guess, to the students, like I'm thinking, like remembering what it was like to be in your shoes. And I feel like when I was in your shoes, I was so hunkered down in it, like you're so in it. And I think that the thing that's awesome about the thesis review, I mean, all final reviews, but especially your thesis review, is that it's this moment to kind of stand back. And I think we couldn't have had the conversations that we had today if the work wasn't at the level that it was at. And I think it takes some time for you to be able to stand back the way that we can stand back. But I hope that we're not the critics that are directing our comments at you. We're inviting you to come to this other side where you can stand back and look at it as well. And I congratulate you on your work.
In general, we hope that, partially, the conversations we've had all year and the conversations we've had today in relation to your projects will lead to furthering your interests in the subject matter. I mean, while they might not rest within, the furthering of the specific proposal, these broader conversations about the subject matter and related issues that surround it, right? And finding solutions for it, answers, right, should be something that you continue to work with, and ideally, as we said before, become kind of like a point of departure, right, or a stepping stone, right, for your career, or furthering interests, right, or following down those roads. So that's what we're hoping you will get out of this whole process first and foremost.
I also would like to add and echo what had been said. I'm also impressed. I've also seen the midterm, some of your projects. I know, like Annie and Eitan, I've seen, I think, the work before. So I mean, I'm also impressed in terms of the development. So I congratulate all of you. One thing that I'm also reminded of is how your projects, as Cordula had also said about kind of the starting point, how each of you have presented like a vision, and what I'm impressed is the idea of your position and as a thesis, and has been, the aim of it is like to create a position and to be able to be expressive and then also clear about your position, and I've seen that today. And also the idea of the vision, I think that's something that I encourage you to continue as you embark on the next phase of your career. Is to that's one of the big things that you are contributing, which is your vision, and your imagination and your creativity. Not everybody could do this work, and especially now that sometimes people lack creativity and imagination, and that's what you bring. So, I encourage you to continue bringing that forward, your sense of wonder, your sense of vision, and your sense of creativity. So congratulations and fantastic work.
Thank you for all the credit.
Thank you, everyone.
You guys it's been great to have. It's always nice to have a group of professionals who give very good, critical feedback that helps us think about things and how I can move forward, but, with a smile. I think it's it is very, very nice to have a healthy conversation. So I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Your comment also makes me think of something I was thinking earlier, which is how graciously this group of students engages in the conversation and takes comments. No one, I don't know, not that anything like super ugly was said, but no, everyone took it in stride. And I found that to be a level of maturity. And I did notice that. So I'll just say it out loud.
And I also think that, whatever you did so far is beyond super amazing, and with all the comments, because in the end it's all about creating a portfolio and getting a job or starting your own practice or doing something completely different, because architecture provides you with a lot of job opportunities. It's about learning, and it's not the final result. It's just about taking that input and thinking, what else can I do? That's why we do portfolio reviews, and so this is not the end. This is just a moment in time. Right, Cordula? Say something.
You're right. You're right. For sure. Now that we have a brighter future ahead of us.
Hopefully.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
It was great having you. It was a long afternoon. I'm sure for some of you it's very late, or so get some rest, and we'll see you again tomorrow morning.
Yes, sounds great. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, students, for great presentations.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, students, and see you tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye. See you tomorrow.
See you with great pleasure.
Ciao, ciao, ciao.
Ciao.